My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real-life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. This week, I'm investigating a rapist and serial killer who travelled up and down the country preying on young, vulnerable women. There are a handful of victims we know about, but police suspect many more. That man is Peter Tobin. We know that Tobin committed the last murder at quite a late age in life. He was 61 years of age. We also know that he committed 2 other murders in 1991 and buried the bodies in the garden of a house in Margate in Kent. And we also know that he was jailed for 14 years and did a 10-year sentence for the double rape of 2 girls that he drugged and thereafter raped. So we know that this man is an absolute serial killer and rapist. What's unique about the Tobin case is that it was the first time offender and geographic profiling had been used together in a nationwide operation to track a suspected serial killer. The senior investigating officer for Strathclyde Police was David Swindle.
Hello, David Swindle.
Hi, David Swindle. My name's Jackie Molton, ex-Scotland Yard detective. I'm really looking forward to come and see you if you will speak to me, David, about your role in Operation Anagram and the detection of Peter Tobin for a number of murders.
Absolutely. Any exposure about Tobin would help find out who else is killed.
So your interest in it because you believe, do you, that Tobin has killed other people?
I believe Tobin has done other crimes, definitely killed other people.
Because it was quite a late time in his life to start raping and killing.
Yes, you don't get to 60 years of age and kill someone the way he did.
I look forward to seeing you, David. Thank you so much.
Good, Jackie. OK, bye.
This is the case of Peter Tobin, a Scottish serial killer. I'm heading up to Glasgow to meet retired Detective Superintendent David Swindle, who ran Operation Anagram. On the 24th of September 2006, Angelika Kluk, a 23-year-old Polish student working as a cleaner at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow, was reported missing by her boyfriend, Martin McCaskill. It was the discovery of her body 5 days later that would lead the police to discover 2 other murders over a decade earlier and confirm Tobin as one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. You were the detective superintendent in charge of CID at Strathclyde Police. What was the police response to the missing inquiry?
This is a day that I'll never forget in my life. The police officers, the uniform officers, were dealing with that as a missing person inquiry at the time. The church had been searched as a routine search. It was a missing person. And within 3 or 4 days, they were very concerned for her safety because the last person that she'd been with was identified as Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender. Now, no one knew he was that. He was using the name Patrick McLaughlin in the church, and he actually had an identification tag, which was Patrick McLaughlin. Tobin had been working at that church for some months. It was probably about 6 months. He was called the handyman at the church. He had been part of the Loaves and Fishes. He helps homeless people, gives them food. So he had ingratiated himself into the church, helping people in the church. He was in a place that was full of vulnerable people.
How did Peter Tobin get identified?
The uniform officers that were dealing with the missing person inquiry had published his photograph in the newspaper, and it was through that he was identified.
So Tobin's no longer around. You've got a missing person. What happened then as far as the police were concerned?
So I arranged for the place to be searched, thoroughly searched by search experts. And I got the phone call about 8 o'clock, 8:15 that night, that Angelica had been found concealed under the floor of the church. There was a small trap door, but only he would know where that is, someone that has knowledge of that church. And she had been put in there, as the judge described it, totally disrespectful, like a bag of rubbish, put under the floor.
David Swindle and his team faced an extremely difficult crime scene. A narrow hatch was the only access through which they could retrieve crucial forensic evidence from Angelica's body.
The advice I had was that she'd been stabbed so many times in the upper chest, and if they moved the body, that could have disturbed it or lost vital evidence. So I had to make a decision, calculated, but it was in the advice of experts, to leave this young woman's body underneath the church.
When you say leave her there, just leave her, do you mean leave her there in order to get a scientist?
Scientist forensic, that was the advice we got from the scientists.
To examine the body?
Aye, that was the advice we got from the scientists, was that if you moved her, you know, we could lose evidence.
So from what you're saying, Tobin is now on the run somewhere else. You've got a body, you've got a prime suspect. How did you find where Tobin was?
So we went on public, you know, went on national TV, and it was on Sky, and it was as a result of that that someone, a nurse in a hospital in London, recognised him, and he was using an alias, another alias. And the big thing is that they didn't have evidence at that point that Tobin was involved, and that was the thing I was concerned about. He was a missing sex offender, and there was a warrant. We got a warrant for him.
He breached
breaching his conditions.
Yeah, breached his...
So he was arrested on that. That allowed us to get some time.
Do you think he knew that you knew he was the prime suspect at that point?
I think he did. But as far as I'm concerned, I think, you know, Tobin was always a prime suspect from day one, and Tobin himself knew he was a prime suspect, and I'm sure at that point he even knew that he was for other crimes as well.
One of the things I found interesting from what David Swindle told me is the fact that because the body was in such an inaccessible place, stuffed in a hole under the floor, Strathclyde police were forced to leave the body there so that forensic evidence could be gathered in situ. That job fell to a young forensic scientist, Carol Rogers. David has given me her number, so I'm going to see if she's willing to meet.
Hi, Carol. This is ex-detective Jackie Molton. I'm looking into the murder of Angelica Klug. I understand you had the challenging task of retrieving forensics at the scene, and I'd like to find out what you remember of that day.
Hi, Jackie. Yes, it's a case that I'll never forget, not only because the examination was carried out under the floorboards in the dark, but also because Angelica was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and I would be happy to meet with you, yes.
How difficult was it for you, Carol, to gain access through the void to Angelica's body?
To give you an idea of how narrow it was, when I tried to go down into the hatch, I had my crime suit on and I had a pager on my belt, and the gap was that narrow that the pager actually jammed me, and I had to get the pager and wiggle it down into the leg of my crime scene suit so I could then fit through the gap. That's how tight it was.
And how had she been deposited within the void?
She was lying directly beneath the hatch. She was lying on her back and her legs were bent, so her knees were kind of bent backwards, so the lower half of her legs were underneath her body.
I also understand, Carol, that Angelica had been gagged with tape.
Yeah. She had a J-cloth in her mouth, and she had insulating tape wrapped several times around her head, around her mouth to gag her.
So as a scientist, you're faced with this ordeal, really. Where did you go to first to collect any samples, and what were you looking for?
I took some swabs from her body, from her abdomen, from her face, samples from her hands in case she'd been involved in a fight, if there'd been some sort of defence. And also the fly of her trousers is unbuttoned. And I took samples round about her pants and her trousers, again, all in an attempt to recover DNA from anyone who's been in contact with these areas.
Did you find any weapons down in the void at all?
We did. When we opened the black bag that was on top of Angelica, there was a blood-stained knife. Now, it had been cleaned, but we found within the laboratory later on there was very heavy blood staining, and that matched the DNA profile of Angelica Kluck. And we also found a small wooden block, which at the time we couldn't work out the part it played. But further down the line, the police searching the premises of the church found 4 wooden table legs. And one of those table legs was eventually examined and had blood matching Angelica on it, and there was wood in her head wound that matched this table leg.
And can you tell me about a pair of jeans that was found in a bin near the murder site?
Yeah, we had a pair of jeans submitted a few days after Angelica's body was found, and we examined them in the laboratory. We found what we call impact spatter blood spots on the jeans, which is typical of someone who's been involved in an assault, and those blood spots matched the DNA profile of Angelica. And on the fly area of the jeans, we found semen matching Peter Tobin, and that was mixed in with cellular material matching Angelica.
That's a huge amount of forensic evidence, isn't it?
Yeah, we had body fluids, we had weapon, we had fingerprints. We had a two-way transfer, which, as a forensic scientist, you know, is the best you can hope for. DNA from the accused on the victim and from the victim on the accused. We had the weapons, we had clothing wore at the time of the murder. There's nothing else you could really want forensically. It was a really strong forensic case, yeah.
I found Carol Rogers, what she had to say about the forensic evidence, fascinating. The fact that she had to go down this small void underneath the church in order to get the best forensic evidence. And, of course, the forensic evidence in the case of Tobin and the murder of Angelica Kluck was vital.
With the forensic evidence now gathered, Strathclyde police were able to build a detailed picture of what happened to Angelica in her final moments. I want to see for myself where this horrific murder took place, so I'm going to St Patrick's Church with David Swindle.
He's taken me to the garage next to the church where Tobin attacked Angelica.
In there, this is where it started. This is where the blood was. This is where, you know, he started that horrible attack, the murder. The priest had left that Sunday afternoon. It was around 3 o'clock. Tobin was in here with Angelica Klook. She believed he was Patrick McLaughlin, a friend, the handyman. She was, as he described, his little apprentice. They were painting a shed which was inside this garage. He had been watching her. He knew she was a vulnerable person. So Tobin took his opportunity. He hit her over the head with a table leg, which was recovered. There was a piece of that in her head. We don't think the stabbing took place in there. We don't really know. He then bound her with tape and cable-tied her hands. And then he dragged her on a large piece of polythene. He dragged her out here, and in that door, and into the church. This is near to where Angelica was deposited. The attack continued as here, and then he put her below the floor.
What astounds me, though, is that this is a church open to the public. Anybody could have walked in, or the priest could have walked in, or a member of the public could have walked in.
Exactly. The church is open. There's a real element of risk here. This is the mark of him. You know, he's got no respect for anyone or respect for humanity. He put her under the floor of his church, but not just, you know, Angelica Klook. He put a bag with the bloodstained clothing, the knife that he'd used to stab her, all that was in there. And then he had cleaned up where it had happened earlier on, tried to clean everything up. In my mind, you know, he was going to take her away.
You don't think that this was going to be a permanent place for Angelica, that he was going to take her elsewhere?
I think this was a temporary deposition site. I think he was going to take her somewhere else. For me, every time I come here, you know, and having dealt with this as an experienced senior investigating officer, this is one of the worst cases I have ever dealt with in my career, and it's something I'll never forget. And every time I come into this church, I think, this was horrendous, absolutely horrendous what he did to Angelica here. What I also think is, this person has never done, this isn't the first time he's done this, and that's what made me think, you know, we need to look at his whole life. He was 60, you know.
Nobody starts killing at 60, do they?
Well, you don't get to that stage, you know, and that theory was, you know, that theory was right. You know, he'd done it before.
Convinced that Tobin had killed before, David Swindle and his team set up a separate investigation called Operation Anagram to uncover other possible victims. What was Operation Anagram?
What it was I called it investigative analysis of a serial killer. So we took Tobin's life and looked at every single thing in his life. We timelined him a way back. We relied on the public for this, putting out there, this is Peter Tobin, this is where he was in these dates. And we obtained from all his friends, previous friends, his wife's or whatever, pictures of him then.
What was his job?
Tobin had various jobs. Every job you can imagine that would allow him opportunities to kill people. He was doing all sorts of illegal stuff, like bootlegging stuff. He was a driver. He worked for a car auction. He was taking cars from Glasgow to England. I mean, we quickly identified that, you know, that this guy, right through his life, he is involved in all sorts of different types of crime.
I've been looking into the evidence uncovered by Strathclyde Police, working on Operation Anagram, into the serial killer, Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin was one of quite a number of children, 7 children, and he was the one that was the kind of, you know, disturbed. He was the one that kind of, from a very early age, was indicating kind of quite bad behaviour. At the age of 7, Tobin was sent to reform school and would later spend time in a young offenders institute. Little is known about Tobin's early crimes, but his first attack on a woman happened when he was in his early 20s. Her name is Margaret, and she was just 17 when she became his girlfriend.
Hi Margaret, this is Jackie Molton, ex-detective from the Met. I'd really like to talk to you about your time with Peter Tobin. Detective Superintendent David Swindle has told me that Tobin was extremely violent towards you, and I realise that it might be a very painful process to revisit this time, but I'd really appreciate it if you would be willing to meet with me.
Hi Jackie, I'd be only too happy to meet with you. I was only 17 years old at the time I met Peter Tobin. I'll never forget it. It was the worst year of my life.
Margaret, how did you first meet Peter Tobin?
My girlfriend and I were at a dance hall in the centre of Glasgow, the Highlanders dance hall, and him and his partner asked us to dance. He was charming, he dressed well, very polite. He seemed to sort of just be very soft and sort of caring. And I was just sort of over the moon that I'd scored, you know, and he was such a nice guy. One weekend day, he took me back to his place, his flat. He wanted to ask me if I wanted a cup of tea or coffee. I took some tea. But we just chatted about anything and everything. We had cars in common. The afternoon just went. And I said, well, I better get back for my dinner. I'll maybe see you later tonight. So I went to the front door and I went to open it and it was just slammed shut in front of my face. He became quite violent then and sort of shook me and said, you're going to do as you're told now. Then the sort of sex started and it was quite rough. It was like torture as well as sex. And if I didn't conform, he always had this penknife in his pocket, and if I said no, I would just get stabbed in the side. It was never a deep enough blade that it would actually do any fatal harm. It was just a warning. I mean, my hips are like railway lines, you know, 2 or 3 times over.
So how did you get out of the place that night?
Well, I didn't. That was me with Tobin then for the next year.
Really?
Yeah.
And did he control who you saw when you went out?
I didn't get out.
Kept you hostage?
He kept me in the flat all the time. I got locked in the flat.
So there's no way that you could shout or scream or get out of a window or...
3 floors up? No,
yeah.
Not really.
Yeah. It's so upsetting to hear what happened to you.
Yeah.
Did you feel that you'd lost your own self-esteem?
I lost my own independence.
You lost everything, you lost yourself.
I lost my own character. I would just... It wasn't me that...
Did you feel like this complete possession?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Margaret was so broken by the physical and mental abuse Tobin inflicted on her that he even forced her to marry him. After months of being under his total control, Tobin's violence escalated to the point when one evening he attacked her so viciously he left her for dead.
There was one night I had enough with him, and I just blatantly said, no, I'm not having any more sex with you. I'm too sore. And he just threw me onto the bed, got a serrated bread knife and put it inside me and turned it like a corkscrew, which is why I can't actually have children.
Dear God.
And left me for dead.
Margaret was left unconscious and bleeding profusely from her wounds. She might have died, but for the fact a neighbour saw blood dripping through the ceiling below and called for an ambulance. What were you left with after this duration of time with Tobin, and he took away your confidence, you lost yourself?
Mm-hmm.
How long does it take for you for those mental and emotional and physical scars to kind of heal?
They never heal. I mean, he left me childless. And no matter what anybody says, and for whatever reason that happens, you never get over the fact not being a proper mother.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've got on and I've succeeded in life.
Obviously, you've succeeded, yeah.
So I'm sort of proud of myself that way, and I've got over the shock of it. But yeah, it's always that there's something missing.
And you often hear, you know, in the media, you know, why people don't go to the police and why they don't complain. And what was it that stopped them going? You've heard from Margaret today why she couldn't go to the police. She was absolutely scared stiff. And I've spoken over the years to many other victims who were just frightened of going to the police because they were on their own, they had nowhere to go. And also because the culture was, sadly, that domestic violence victims were never believed. I can't help thinking that if it hadn't been for the neighbour downstairs calling for help, Margaret would have probably been Tobin's first murder victim, way back in 1969. This story makes clear to me that Tobin used coercion and control to get what he wanted. This pattern of manipulative behaviour would continue right up to his trial for the murder of Angelica Kluk in March 2007, when he tried to overturn the overwhelming forensic evidence against him. Dorothy Bain was the prosecutor in the Peter Tobin trial, so I want to find out her impression of him. Dorothy Bain, in 2007, you were the prosecuting counsel in the case of Peter Tobin. The importance of the scientific evidence.
Yes.
This was major forensic evidence, wasn't it, that was presented to the court?
Yes, the forensic scientists did the most amazing professional job, and the evidence they secured ultimately played an important part in the conviction of Peter Tobin.
Were there any complications in the Tobin case? Because part of Tobin's defence, as I understand it, was that he had consensual sex with Angelica Kluk.
The defence counsel in the case was Donald Finlay QC. As part of the defence to the case that he would have been instructed to present to the jury, it did involve identifying that Angelica Kluk was perhaps promiscuous and had been in more than one sexual relationship at the time. But the young woman's diaries revealed a deep and loving relationship with Martin McCaskill. She described, for instance, times that they were together and they felt as if they were the richest people in the world. And reading her diaries about the relationship was very moving, and it was a significant part of the case. in court that her diaries were read and the jury were informed of the extent of her relationship with Martin McCaskill.
But when you're kind of looking at Tobin on a daily basis, or you're conscious of his presence in the dock, what was your impression about this man that was sitting in the dock before you that had been accused of this horrendous murder?
It struck me that he was very slight, small, and seemed insignificant.
Mm-hmm.
He was somebody that you wouldn't have given a second thought to. You certainly wouldn't have looked at him and thought that he was capable of what he did.
After a 6-week trial in May 2007, Peter Tobin was found guilty of the rape and murder of Angelica Kluk and sentenced to a minimum of 21 years in prison. With Tobin now convicted, David Swindle and his team from Operation Anagram were able to continue questioning him about his past in their hunt to uncover other potential victims. Operation Anagram discovered that 16 years earlier, in 1991, Tobin had remarried, had a young son, and was living in the town of Bathgate in Scotland. They also discovered that in the same year, a teenager, 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, was reported missing. She was last seen in Bathgate. Detective Bert Swanson, who worked on the original missing person case, was alerted to this new piece of evidence.
Hi, Bert. This is Jackie Molton, former detective at the Met. David Swindle has given me your name and number, and I'd like to talk to you about the Vicky Hamilton case, if that would be okay with you.
Yes, I was in charge of the review. I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
But in 1991, Vicky Hamilton was 15 years of age. She'd gone to see her sister, who was living in a town called Livingstone near Edinburgh. And Vicky was last seen in Bathgate in the town centre eating some chips, and from then was never seen again.
That's correct. That's it in a nutshell, in effect. I mean, she was perhaps immature for her years. She had never gone on her own, and so this was an adventure tour. And sadly, it involved 2 buses. It involved a change. She was constantly asking about where do I change, what time do I get off, what time is this bus? So it was an adventure, and sadly it was her first, and as I understand it, her last.
At the time that she had gone missing, did the police find any of Vicky's property, a bag or a handbag?
Yes, it was about a week after that Vicky went missing that a purse, which was subsequently found to be the property of Vicky, was recovered in St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh, which is right next to the bus station.
The police investigating the disappearance of Vicky had kept that purse?
Kept the purse. My concern with the purse was that I was aware that the programme, the missing person, Vicky Hamilton, had featured on Crime Watch at some stage. And I viewed that programme, and I was kind of horrified to see that they had the purse sitting on the desk, and it was with no paper, no wrapping, nothing on it. It was unprotected from everything. We speak about DNA. It was 1991, and although DNA was there were still forces that it was relatively new, and you didn't really explore and exploit it to the maximum.
The purse became a problematic piece of evidence, so I'm meeting with Cold Case Reviewing Officer for Strathclyde Police, Derek Patterson, to find out what they did next.
The purse was complicated in the sense that we weren't overly optimistic about finding DNA from it, but the most likely DNA profile you would get in those circumstances would be from Vicky, bearing in mind she was the owner of the purse. However, it didn't transpire that way. A profile was developed from the purse, which eventually we found was a very, very close match to the suspect in the case. The DNA profile from the purse was not from Peter Tobin, but it was from a very close relative, which then led to swabs being taken from his son in the final match.
Peter Tobin had brought up his son from where he lived with his mum down south and for a little holiday. So we know that Peter Tobin had his son at the time with him, just a small child.
Yeah.
When Vicky Hamilton went missing.
Yeah. It was always assumed that Tobin's son had put the purse to his mouth, simply because saliva is such a good source for DNA. And to think that it had survived, having been outdoors, having been through all the various hands, it was an excellent recovery. It was excellent work.
The police now had solid forensic evidence. They had Vicky's purse with a strong DNA link to Tobin. Then, after a search of Tobin's house in Bathgate, they discovered a knife with traces of Vicky's DNA. But the big problem was they didn't have a body. Operation Anagram began sharing information with other police forces. One of them was Essex Police, who informed them that another teenager had also gone missing in 1991. Her name was Dinah McNichol. The team began looking at other addresses that Tobin had occupied and made a significant and chilling discovery. Soon after Vicky Hamilton had disappeared, and just before Dinah had disappeared, Tobin had moved from Bathgate to a house in Margate in Kent. It was enough evidence to instigate a police search of Tobin's Margate address. Lucy Syborn was the forensic archaeologist brought in to lead the search for Dinah's body.
Lucy Syborn, I understand you were called to a house in Margate to do an archaeological dig.
That's right.
What were you told about this incident?
They thought the body of Dinah McNichol may be on the premises somewhere in the garden or the house. And could we assist with the investigation to see if we could locate the body if it was there? So the first thing we need to do is try and establish what the ground would be like if it hadn't been disturbed, so we know what we're looking for, so then we recognise any changes and disturbance. A cut had been made down through the soils into the chalk. We recognised that we had disturbance, so we start excavating that cut and we came across black bin liner. Then clearing it, we could see there were in fact 2 black bin liners there. The size and shape suggested that they could have been a person.
When you say you've got 2 bin liners, does that mean the body had been cut in half?
Yes. Yeah.
Crikey. So you hand the body over to the police, a subsequent post-mortem. What were you told about the person, the body, what had happened?
We were told that we'd assumed we'd found Dinah McNichol, and then when we returned the next day, post-mortem had established that it wasn't Dinah, it was, in fact, Vicky Hamilton.
Police suspect that having picked up Vicky Hamilton from the bus stop, Peter Tobin had lured her back to his flat where he murdered her. Sometime later, he transported her body south to Margate, where he buried her in the garden of 50 Irvine Drive. Tobin reportedly told his neighbour that he was digging a sandpit for his son.
And was Dinah McNichol in that garden?
Yes. Yeah.
And where was she in comparison to where Vicky Hamilton was situated?
On the same side of the garden, and Dinah McNichol was underneath the patio, so much closer to the house.
Was Dinah McNichol in plastic bags, and was she a complete body or had been severed?
Complete body, yep, in plastic bags, and then encased in concrete.
Dear, dear.
The discovery of the two bodies confirmed Detective David Swindle's worst fears, that Peter Tobin was indeed a serial killer. I'm returning to see David Swindle to find out how Tobin reacted to the charges.
What did he say in an interview about two bodies are in a garden at Margate for which he lived in that house? What did he say to that?
Someone must have put them there. He was fitted up.
OK.
His fingerprint, everything. It's about control. It's about power. And that's what he wants all the time, because every time the officer was interviewing him, he wanted to try something else. Can you get me cigarettes? Can you bring me a book? Can you do this? And he just wants to control everything. He thinks he's going to get away with it. He's so arrogant on it.
In 2008, Tobin was charged and faced 2 separate trials for the murders of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. He was found guilty and received 2 further life sentences. Since his convictions, Tobin has refused to cooperate with detectives investigating other possible victims.
We would never have known, if it hadn't been, sadly, for the murder of Angelica Klook, and if it hadn't been for me forming Operation Anagram, we would never had Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol and results for what happened for their family. The thing is, these are the ones we know about. My feeling is that we don't have everything. We don't know all the victims that Tobin has killed. He's done more. He's done others. I'm sure of that. But because of the way he targets people, because of the way he conceals the victims' bodies, we'll never know.
But for me, Tobin's multiple convictions still beg the question of what drove him to commit such brutal and degrading crimes. Someone who has been examining Tobin's case and may have some answers is forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone.
In interviews, he shows no remorse and, just has no kind of conscience at all about anything that he's done.
Yes, well, the no remorse bit does not come as a surprise to me in the slightest. It's probably one of the few times he's ever been honest about anything.
Would you describe Tobin as a psychopath?
Yes, I would. I don't think there's any room for doubt about that. To be able to perform these atrocious acts, and as we say, probably many more of them, and to openly declare that he had absolutely no remorse or regrets at all. If he said that, then that ipso facto puts him down as a psychopath.
And is that how you would categorise him as a killer?
Yes, I would. And a relatively organised sexual murderer who is psychopathic, yes, I would.
When he killed Angelica Klook, Tobin was 61 years of age. Is that quite unusual for a man to carry on being a serial killer since he started, as we know, in 1991?
Nothing's going to stop him having these urges. Nothing at all. And they are very, very deeply seated. They must be, if he has that same sort of modus operandi. I, for one, wouldn't want to put any money down at all that he would stop. And behind bars is where he should stay.
I want to return to the church where Angelica was murdered, a place where you would never expect such a brutal crime to take place.
I think it's poignant that we're standing in this beautiful church, which for people that come to church is a place of sanctuary, a place of worship, a place of peace. And this church was the scene of a terrible murder. Tobin knew that Angelica was working here in order to better her life as a young student. So it just sits with you really, really uncomfortable in this beautiful church. People come to churches to confess their sins. Tobin is committing the greatest sin in this church. So there's that poignancy. It's just despicable. As a detective, I've investigated numerous murder cases, and what always hits me is the sheer waste of life. Here we have 3 young women whose lives were brutally cut short in such a horrific manner. The perpetrator has been jailed for the rest of his life, but that's no comfort for the families and friends of these women. I know they will never be forgotten. My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. The case I'm looking at this week is almost impossible to comprehend. The murder of 3 small children by their own mother. I know from personal experience the strain a case like this would place on the investigating officers as they try to do their jobs professionally while faced with such tragic circumstances. This is a very, very, very sad case on a number of levels. It's the case of Theresa Riggi, who killed her 3 children, a 5-year-old girl and twin boys aged 8. She was living in Edinburgh at the time, recently separated from her husband. There was a gas explosion at the place where she was living, and when police investigated it, they found her very severely injured, broken bones. But sadly, in her home, they found the bodies of 3 children. A knife had been used to stab each child 8 times. And what came out of the investigation was that Theresa was going to be divorced. Her husband was going to fight her for the custody of the children, as I understand it, and she killed them. This case, I would imagine, from looking at it, would be particularly difficult because every murder of one child is really painful. To see 3 young children's lives being taken away at such a young age, it's just a real sad case. This is the case of Theresa Riggi. Whichever way you look at this case, it's filled with sadness. Theresa and her husband Pasquale had moved to the UK in 1997 for his job in the oil industry. They had 3 children, twins Austin and Luke, then Cecilia. Eventually they settled in Edinburgh, but Theresa's overly possessive relationship with the children led to friction between the couple. When they split up, Pasquale struggled to get visitation, so they were in conflict over custody. But in this case, that conflict spilled over into tragedy. The first person I want to meet about exactly what happened
is retired CID officer for Lothian and Borders Police, Neil Spowett.
Hi Neil, this is Jackie Molton. I'm an ex-detective from the Metropolitan Police, and I'm looking into the murder by Theresa Riggi of her 3 children. I believe you were the first officer at the scene, and I'd be very interested to meet you to find out what happened that day.
Hello Jackie, it's Neil Spowett here. I've got your message. Yes, I'm quite happy to meet up with you.
It was a call that came in just after lunchtime about an explosion in a block of flats which they thought was a gas explosion. I certainly didn't think immediately that was going to involve myself, but the radio traffic suggested there was some fatalities and there was possibly children who'd died in the explosion. So I made my way to the house. There was a lot of police officers already there, and they'd managed to cordon some of the road off. And I spoke to a female officer who'd been on my shift when I'd been in uniform. She knew me, I knew her, so I knew I'd get the right sort of information from her, which I did. She informed me that the fire brigade had been in. They thought it was a gas explosion. Shortly after the explosion, a woman had jumped or had fallen from the second floor of the block of flats. And she also told me that both the fire brigade and the ambulance service who'd attended had been into the house, and they'd reported to her that there were 3 children who were dead within a bedroom on the top floor.
When detectives like yourself are called to, a crime scene where there are bodies, was there an inclination for you to call out the scientific team first?
My first thing I've got to do is ensure the protection of the crime scene, to ensure that nothing's interfered with and that everything is as it was or as best as it could be. And I also had to make sure that somebody was dealing with the lady who'd been taken away from the locus. At that time I didn't know what she was. I didn't know if she was somebody who'd just been injured as part of this gas explosion. I certainly didn't know she might have been a suspect, although it was always a possibility. So I had to ensure the officers that were with her and who were going to deal with her knew what they were dealing with and kind of took all precautions. No police officers had actually been into the house. All the information we'd got had come from the fire brigade and the ambulance service who'd been in, so at some point we had to go in and check everything.
Of course, it's very, very difficult when children are involved, so it's a difficult question to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So can you describe what you saw?
The first level was where the living room was. On going into that, you could see there'd been signs of some sort of explosion. The gas hob was off the worktops at an angle. There was scorching around part of the room. So then I have to move up onto the top floor. I do recall blood. I've seen a lot of blood. I remember women's clothing, heavily blood-stained clothing. And then it's the last room you have to go into is where the kids were. It was difficult to get in because they were behind the door. The room they were in was a bedroom with a double bed and cupboards or units or a wardrobe on the wall. The kids had obviously been placed where they were. They certainly hadn't ended up there as a result of anything that had happened to them. They quite clearly had been...
On the bed?
I don't know. They were on the floor. They'd quite clearly been put there. So I do remember the 3 of them lying on the floor. You could see injuries to them, which weren't consistent with a gas explosion. And the window of that room was open, where obviously she jumped out of.
And it was obvious to you there were some injuries to them?
Yeah, I could see facially and on their hands. I seem to remember injuries to one of their hands, which maybe made me think there were defensive injuries, which made me think there'd been a knife involved. And certainly some of the injuries I could see, although I was only looking at their face and their hands. That's what it suggested to me.
And for you and I and all those detectives that are out there, that's the worst crime that one can investigate. And now you're faced with 3 young children whose lives have been taken from them. How did you feel yourself when you went into that room?
I think it's quite strange because I've been to so many scenes, or I'd been to so many scenes in the time I was in the police, and I can remember a lot about most of them, but my brain has blanked a lot of this one out, and I can remember bits of it, and I can remember roughly what was there. The detail has gone now, which I think I've cancelled that detail out.
In order, understandably, to kind of protect one's emotions, and that was something that kind of unconsciously has happened to you. Whichever way we look at this case, whichever way, whichever aspect, it's just one of pure tragedy.
Most definitely, yeah. Most definitely. There's no other way to explain it, really.
Did you remain on the case?
I didn't. My job was kind of done on the day with the dealing with the crime scene and the sort of immediate actions that needed to be done once it had all come in. So once all these things had been done and everything was moving, I didn't stay on it, which was fine. I didn't particularly want to.
I think one of the most interesting things that comes out of this is that when police are called to, in this case, a report of a gas explosion with fatalities, but what actually transpires is a completely different story. So you're driving here thinking one thing, and then you're absolutely faced with something completely different, the death of 3 young children. You then have to look at an investigation with completely different eyes.
It became clear very quickly that what appeared to be a tragic gas explosion was in fact much more sinister, and that far from being a victim herself, the perpetrator was the mother of the children, Theresa Riggi. She was now seriously injured in hospital with self-inflicted stab wounds, a collapsed lung, and several bone fractures. One of the most shocking facts to emerge was that each of the children had been stabbed 8 times with separate kitchen knives, which were then placed next to their bodies. To get a better understanding of what happened, I want to visit the scene for myself. I'm hoping that the senior investigating officer, retired Detective Keith Hardy, will join me.
Hi Keith, this is Jackie Molton, formerly of the Met Police. I'm looking at the Theresa Riggi case. Would you be happy to meet me at the location of where the murders took place?
Hi Jackie, that's not a problem. I look forward to meeting you.
Keith, we're at the scene of the tragedy. Can you talk me through what happened when you turned up as the SIO?
Sure, well, we basically closed off the road that you can see here because of the various emergency vehicles, fire service, ambulances, police, because we didn't know what we were dealing with. That caused a great deal of disruption, but we very quickly got the area over here sealed off and treated that as a potential crime scene, if you like. So we managed to get control of that area pretty quickly, and by the time I arrived, Theresa had been taken to the hospital after jumping from the balcony. So that's what I was met with, if you like, when I got here.
So personally, how long did you remain here in your hub?
I was here for most of the evening, probably into the early hours of the next morning, because this was my #1 priority. I very quickly realised, having got here, that it was a crime scene, and my job was to investigate the crime. I wanted to be satisfied that we exhausted every potential investigative opportunity that was within the flat.
How long was it after arriving at the scene that Theresa Riggi became the prime suspect?
Not long at all, to be honest with you. When I got here, it was fairly apparent the explosion wasn't sufficient to blow somebody out the window. There were neighbours who were eyewitnesses to her deliberately jumping from the balcony. There again, did we know, was she acting on her own or was there other persons involved? These were all the unknowns, but I was entirely satisfied she was our prime suspect at the time.
When the death of 3 children in a supposed gas explosion became a murder inquiry, the prime suspect emerged as their own mother, Theresa Riggi. I want to find out how Senior Investigating Officer Keith Hardy progressed this most unusual and devastating investigation.
We didn't know what we were dealing with at the time, so I got 2 of my detectives to get suited up and go in, and then it was reported back to me that there was 3 dead children within the flat. And then it was very apparent, I think, from the outset that these children were victims of violence, to say the least, and it was a criminal inquiry we were dealing with.
And in those investigations, what did you discover?
There was a couple of things that caused me concern. The flat next to the flat Theresa was living in, the door was lying open. So I immediately got that flat, thinking it might be a secondary crime scene type thing. We just didn't know what we were dealing with. Nobody was making themselves known to us as being the occupier of that flat. Got that flat sealed off and also established from the sort of routine inquiry we'd carry out, there was a car parked in the car park, registered to Pasquale Riggi, Theresa's estranged husband and the father of the children. So my priority from there was we need to trace Pasquale, find out where he is, and obviously we've got some horrific information to impart to him. Shortly thereafter, I got contacted by our control room to say that Pasquale Riggi's solicitor had been in touch with the control room. He'd heard on the news there'd been a major incident in Slateford Road in Edinburgh, and he knew Theresa resided in that area. So he just contacted his solicitor to say, look, I'm slightly concerned that this might relate to her.
And what did you learn from Pasquale about his estranged wife, Theresa?
At that time, nothing, because obviously we impart the information we have, and then he's left to deal with the news with the understanding that, you know, we would have to come back and see him. The information that came from Pasquale was very much that he never ever thought for 1 second Theresa would harm the children. We established that she was, if anything, overprotective. She was certainly of a mind that she'd never do anything to harm the children. She used to put alarms on the 3 children, and if they got out with a 50-metre radius of her, the alarm would go off. She wore the sort of base unit, and she would go and check on the welfare and the safety of her kids. So I would have to say throughout the inquiry, we never ever found anybody who said, oh, I had my suspicions of her. A couple of bits of behaviour were slightly unusual, but nothing that caused any concern as far as I was concerned. And, you know, even the days leading up to the terrible tragedy, she was taking them to the zoo, she was taking them out to places, you know, for the kids to have a really nice and enjoyable time. So he had no concerns whatsoever, other than perhaps a bit overprotective, as her ability as a mother, if you like.
Were you able to interview Theresa?
No, she had significant injuries from her jumping from the balcony. So she was taken to hospital under police guard. She wasn't detained or arrested at the time. My intention was to detain her. And it was quite apparent, I think, once we'd carried out the forensics, etc., that she was responsible. But I wanted, because I'm a detective, I wanted an admission. I wanted her sat in front of 2 detectives and to tell them what she'd done. But the general consensus, and I would have to say rightly so, was there was no need for an interview. We were quite satisfied we had a compelling case against her without any form of interview.
With Theresa Riggi in hospital and unable to answer questions, the police turned their attention to her estranged husband, Pasquale Riggi. In my experience in cases like this, family members may have useful information, but they do have to be handled sensitively. The job of talking to Pasquale fell to skilled family liaison officers who became a bridge between him and the investigation. The family liaison officer is a detective whose job is to get information from the family. Primarily, you're there in a detective role, but equally, you're there as a kind of liaison between the senior investigating officer and the family. And in this particular job, you know, it must have been terrible, heart-wrenching for the family liaison officer, because it's the mother of the 3 children and the man's wife. He's got to get his head around that fact that his own wife has killed their 3 children, and the fact that he's lost his 3 children. Just can't imagine the pain. How does anybody, you know, cope with that? How do you recover from that? And as a family liaison officer, you know, I'm sure you must kind of soak up some of that emotion. It would be almost impossible not to. I want to meet one of the key family liaison officers for the case, retired detective Diane Smith.
Hi, Diane. I'm Jackie Molton. Keith Hardy has given me your number. I want to find out more about the Theresa Riggi case, and I believe you were tasked with interviewing Pasquale Riggi when it was revealed his children had been murdered. Would you be happy to meet with me to tell me how you handled this very delicate situation?
Hi, Jackie. Yes, I was a detective constable in the major crime team at that time. This case has always stayed with me, and I'd be happy to talk to you.
For me personally, it's the case that had the most impact on me. I've been family liaison officer in a number of cases, but this one involved children. And I think the fact that there was children involved and also their lives were taken by the person who was meant to nurture and protect them, that has to have an impact. For anybody to lose a family member is terrible. To lose a child, you can't begin to imagine what it's like. To lose 3 is just beyond what you could imagine. The man was devastated.
Of course. You must have had to have huge sensitivity. You can't go armed with, you know, a notebook and a pen and start taking statements at that point.
Oh, you certainly would never start taking statements. When my colleague and I met Pasquale, we sat down and explained our role, that we were investigators and that we would be asking him lots and lots of questions. And at some stage we would take a statement, but not then. The first night he went up there to see Pasquale in his house. I was only in the house 5 minutes and there was light bulbs flashing outside as the press photographers and the media were clambering all over his garden trying to photograph him hours after he'd learned about the death of his children, yes. That was one of the biggest issues we had to deal with. There was journalists all over the place. They were in the driveway. They would hide in bushes there waiting for him coming out. It got to the stage where the press were intruding so much that 1 week into the inquiry, he agreed to sit. We took him to a hotel and we had a television reporter, there was somebody from the radio and there was somebody from a newspaper, and he gave an interview about what it meant to have lost the children. And to me, that was above and beyond, you know, to ask him, but he did that so that they would leave him in peace. And there had been an agreed question, you know, questions had been agreed beforehand, but as usual, they tried to take it a wee bit further than that, and we had to stop the interview eventually.
Presumably you had to find out about their relationship and how well they got on, and I understand in this case that they had separated and Mr. Riggi was asking for a divorce.
You're correct. In any case, family liaison officers are responsible for obtaining the background information in relation to the family. Because Pasquale, Theresa Riggi and the children were American nationals living in Scotland, Pasquale was the one that had the most information. They didn't have other members of the family that you could go and interview, so the majority of the information was coming from Pasquale. And it was difficult because we needed information quickly to progress the investigation, but you can't sit somebody down in the first few days and expect them to sit there while you're writing.
Of course.
So in this case, I think it was between 3 and 4 weeks before we actually started to take a formal statement from Pasquale. And I think it took about 7 weeks to complete the statement.
What did you learn during your investigation about Theresa Riggi? What kind of person was she, do you think?
Prior to the murders, Pasquale had been pursuing a residency order for his children, and at that time the courts appointed a psychologist to observe the children, both in Pasquale's company and in Theresa's company. And it became obvious that her report was in favour of Pasquale. Having the children's care, in my opinion, it would appear that Theresa Riggi was obsessive over the care of the children. She believed that no one could love them or look after them the way she could.
It's been fascinating talking to Diane, but one thing that struck me was what she said about the activities of the media. Murder cases always grab the headlines and sell newspapers, but this one was explosive. A mother killing her own children is so rare and shocking that journalists are under pressure to report every tiny detail. I want to find out more about how this case was covered from Marion Scott, a reporter for the Sunday Mail at the time.
Hi, Marion. I'm looking back at the case of Theresa Riggi. I understand you reported on it from the very first day. I'd be fascinated to talk to you about what information you uncovered.
Hi, Jackie. Yes, you're correct. I did work on the Theresa Riggi case right through to the trial, and it was a really fascinating case, absolutely shocking. I'm happy to meet up with you to chat about it.
Marion Scott, you're a very experienced journalist. I understand you were called to the scene in Edinburgh. Can you tell me about that, please?
Yes, we got very early reports that there had been a very, very serious crime. So, of course, like all newspapers, we all rushed to the scene to see what was happening there. The place was, cordoned off by the police, so it was very difficult to get very, very close to the actual scene. I just remember looking up and seeing there was activity in the flat where she lived, and we spent quite a time trying to speak to neighbours and to people who had been there when the incident had happened.
And did the neighbours know of Theresa Riggi?
They knew of Theresa Riggi, some of them did. Not all of them. She had only been recently there, but because she was quite an unusual looking woman, I would imagine that she would have drawn attention.
How much pressure do you feel personally to get a story out there and to find out as much as you can? Do you feel that pressure?
Of course, yes. I think because it was such a dreadful, dreadful crime, and it was a mother that was involved, the pressure was enormous because it's something that the public would want to read about. So, of course, the pressure was on.
Can you paint a picture for us, Marion, before she was charged? What kind of person was she?
We knew that she was a very middle-class woman. She came from an affluent background. She was obviously a very talented woman. She appeared to have been in some kind of complex separation in which her husband and herself were arguing over the children. And it seemed to be a very distressing situation. The husband, Pasquale, obviously did not wish to discuss what had happened. He was in great shock. So it was quite difficult to actually put together a picture of her.
In this occasion, the police did not interview her at all.
No, it was quite surprising. I was taken aback when I heard that. But I understand that she was sent almost immediately to under the care of psychiatrists.
Were they able to tell you anything about the case at all?
Well, we were able to glean some things, but it was a very, very tight investigation. It's not like a case where they didn't know who was responsible. So it was very quick, and it was processed to the court very, very quickly.
A picture began to emerge of Theresa Riggi, far removed from the perfect image she projected of an elegant and protective mother. She was, in fact, a deeply troubled woman with a personality disorder that drove her to commit the most devastating of crimes. One of the chilling facts that emerged was that Theresa phoned Pasquale 2 days before the murders. She asked him, "Are you going to take my children away from me?" He said she had left him no choice. Her reply was, "Say goodbye then." Despite the fact the investigating team didn't ever interview her, Theresa was charged with the murder of her 3 children and transferred to a team of psychiatrists for assessment before she could stand trial. I want to find out more about how the court case played out from Keith Hardy.
So what was she sentenced for?
She was sentenced for the culpable homicide of the 3 children, but it wasn't murder. Some people say it's one below murder, culpable homicide, through diminished responsibility. So it was all about her state of mind when she committed the crime. And there was, I know there was at least 4 or 5 different psychiatrists, psychologists interviewed her while she was in custody and reported back to the Crown that she was not of sound mind. So the judge, his hands were tied, if you like, as to what she could be found guilty of. There's no point to the Crown instructing 4 or 5 eminent psychologists, psychiatrists to assess this woman and then ignore what their finding was, And the unanimous finding was that she wasn't of sound mind. So it was culpable homicide through diminished responsibility.
Are you able to say what her personality disorders were as described by the expert psychologists and psychiatrists? What did they say that she had? Because I understand she was not mentally ill, but she had personality disorder.
Yeah, I think there was 5 different psychiatrists assessed her and provided reports to the court. That's all after we'd finished with the process. That's when she's in custody. And obviously the judge at the time decided that she wasn't of sound mind when she committed the crime, which caused Pasquale a great deal of angst. And I suppose if you take it back to the basic, was she mad or bad? He thought she was bad. He thought she killed the children to prevent them going into his custody. But the reports from the qualified experts were overwhelming. And I always thought to myself, could a mother of 3 children and of sound mind actually kill her 3 children? And I think no. But again, you know, I'm not a qualified expert in that field, but I just feel that somebody to kill their own 3 children can't be of sound mind.
In February 2011, 6 months after the death of the children, Theresa Riggi was found guilty of the murders of 8-year-old twins, Austin and Luke, and 5-year-old Cecilia, on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Within weeks, she was attacked by other inmates and had to be moved. 4 years later, she died of natural causes in her cell at Rampton High Secure Hospital. Justice may ultimately have been done, but it still begs a huge question. What sort of person was Theresa Riggi that she could commit this most taboo of crimes? Journalist Marion Scott continued to follow the case after Theresa had been imprisoned, so I'm going back to meet her to find out what her research reveals.
After her death, I was contacted by someone who had been writing to her. They had met through a website, a dating website, and they had continued to write to each other.
Was that a man?
It was a man, yes, that she had been writing to, I think, for quite some time.
And when you read the letters, what impression did you get of Theresa?
I thought she was an extremely insular person in that she was histrionic. She demanded perfection in herself and those round about her. She was extremely possessive of her children. She had very grandiose expectations and belief in herself. And all the way through these letters, you can see references to how she perceived herself to be very much better than the people round about her.
It's almost like there was an addiction to perfection and also an appearance addiction, which you can see, you know, how the children are dressed and how she's dressed and how, when she was remanded in prison, she had the same kind of outfit on, that when she committed these crimes, she was wearing that outfit.
She said, actually, in her letters that the children had chosen that outfit for her. So that is the level of the delusion that she was under. If you think about it, though, the image that she is going to portray to people, she's striven her whole life to be the perfect woman, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. It must be very difficult for someone else looking in on that perhaps didn't have the capability to know what was really going on in her mind. So how were they ever going to be able to chip through that to see that she has got a severe personality disorder?
And in the letters that you have read, is there any indication of remorse by Theresa Riggi?
None at all. That comes across very clearly, that she has absolutely no remorse for what she did. She never blames herself. She blames others. She blames her husband. She accuses him of treating the children like possessions, but doesn't blame herself for the dreadful things that she did to them.
Of treating them like possessions.
And treating them like possessions.
And she also perceived herself to be a victim.
Yes, like many of these child killers, family annihilators, it all comes down to, look what you made me do. They see themselves as the victim, although they are actually the perpetrator, the killer. They perceive themselves as the victim. I would never have done this if it hadn't been for you, what you did to me. She's trying to explain what it feels like. And she says it's like having your heart ripped out. And everyone's saying, live. But how do you live without a vital organ? My children were my vital organs. And yet she was prepared to destroy them for the sake of one-upmanship against the husband that she was in conflict with.
And again, in the letters, you could see her own narcissism. And then when she, in actual fact, was attacked in jail by another prisoner, and she speaks of this person getting their 5 minutes of fame. And she also talks about being a mother-type influence, if you like, to other women in the prison. She says that it was quite sad knowing that they'd come from backgrounds that hadn't had that primary caregiver as a mother, and here as a mother she'd killed her own 3 children.
I know it's somewhat ludicrous. She portrays herself as being a mother to these women who were in the jail beside her, and not only were they women from completely different backgrounds, very, very rough backgrounds, they had actually attacked her for being the killer of her own children.
And she also kind of believes that she is being looked after, makes reference to God looking after her, God making a connection between her and her own children, and in actual fact she does make reference to wanting to be reunited with her children.
Yes.
And in fairness to her, says that that will cause kind of comfort to others if she was no longer kind of around.
She said that my survival is nothing short of miraculous, and I must believe that God and my children have something to do with that. So again, with the poses, you know, which she's always looking up as if she's getting a message from God or her children, this comes through again with that kind of phrasing, you know, that she is being guided from above, and not to worry, you know, not to worry, not to blame herself. And this comes across in her letters as well, that she knows she's been given forgiveness for what she has done. If you think about what she actually did, she fell out with her husband and told him, say goodbye then. And it wasn't an act of huge emotion that she cracked right away and did something. This was a carefully thought out killing of 3 children. She waited a full day before she actually did the act. She had made a special record for them to play in the background. I think she called the piece of music Angels by Theresa Riggi. And one by one, she stabbed those children 8 times each.
With a different knife each time?
With a different knife each time, and then laid their bodies out side by side. You have to surmise that they must have watched each other dying, because she did it one by one. That was absolutely horrific.
These cases, you know, I can only speak for me, you know, they're very, very hard to understand, aren't they, for me?
They are very hard to understand. And I think the revulsion that people feel towards Theresa is even more than they do towards the men. Because she was a woman is seen as a nurturer and a carer, a mother. And, you know, for the public to accept that a mother could do that to her own children is quite hard.
Do you recall what the judge said about Theresa Riggi in this particular crime?
The judge was Lord Baracadale, and I think that he had quite a quandary facing him, because it was very unusual for a woman to have committed such terrible crimes. And from the comments he made, you can see the inner turmoil that he was going through. He described the crime as a devastating family tragedy. He said that Theresa Riggi, she was abnormally possessive, and her love for her children was obvious, but it was abnormal because it was so possessive. He also struggled with the fact that she was pleading diminished responsibility, and he actually said it's almost to reduce the crime by pleading this way. In any other place, this would have been seen as an exceptionally wicked crime. It was almost like a way out.
Yeah, sure.
Theresa Riggi was a complicated and troubled woman with a pathological fear of losing control of her children. A fear so great that she was prepared to kill them in a devastating act of family annihilation. This kind of crime is so rare, I want to find out more about why her mental condition drove her so far. Someone who might have some answers is forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone.
Theresa Riggi used 3 separate knives to kill her children. What was that about?
Well, part of her diagnosis by the psychologists and psychiatrists at the time was that one of her personality disorders was histrionic, and I think that plays finely into the sense of occasion and the ritualism of it all, and the lining up of the children side by side with the knives placed in front of them. All of that shows some sense of portent and occasion, which means it wasn't some sort of frenzied thing. It was calculated, it was seen through, and it was, dare I say it, ordered. So what you've got there is someone who knows exactly what they're doing, enacting a ritual which she intended so to do.
Would you describe this as family annihilation?
I can't see a better way of describing it, because it isn't solely the 3 children that were killed, It went much broader than that to the outer family, and in particular the father, who is bereft as a consequence. And that may have implications for why the children were killed, so that she could use them as a weapon against him personally, because clearly there was a great deal of bitterness towards him.
Is that like a revenge killing as well?
I think it's got an element of revenge in it, certainly. And one only has to look at her last words to the father. She said to him, "Are you going to take my children away from me?" Notice the my children and me, completely excluding him. And he said, "Well, you leave me with no alternative." To which she said, "Well, say goodbye then," and put the phone down. And it was thereafter that the children were murdered in this dreadful way.
The judge spoke that she did not suffer from a mental illness. Is a personality disorder part of a mental illness?
No, it isn't. They are considered to be different. Mental illness contains such things as schizophrenia, psychosis and the like, and the alternative of the personality disorders, of which there's 10 or more, depending on which versions you use, are ones which interfere as a lifestyle. I think we can see the dynamics of the family were breaking down and had got really to rock bottom towards the end, with her being ultra possessive by any parent's standards of the children. And the very possibility, which was a very real possibility, that she would lose the children. But from getting from there to murdering them and saying, well, if I can't have them, no one's going to have them, rationalising it under the God thing, you're all going to go to heaven because the world's too dreadful, and I'm coming with you. All of it very histrionic in its conceptualisation. And even when she survived the suicide attempt, then she said, actually, God made me live so that I could make my husband pay for what he did. So there was clearly an element of revenge right from the outset.
Motivated by hatred against the other person.
Revenge can be motivated by a number of source factors, but hatred of the other person is certainly one of them. But in this particular case, total hatred of him and a resentment of his presence. She did not want to share those children with anybody. She wanted them as her fiefdom and wanted no one, including her husband, the natural father of the children.
But he would have no role in the sense.
He would have no role, and she did her best to exclude him altogether. And as he said, leaving him no alternative if she won't let him see the children. It's very sad.
And you can hardly imagine how a man could get over the loss of his 3 children. It's just...
He articulated it. He said he would never go a day without thinking of them 100 times, and that the only thing that can get him through it is remembering those few days he was allowed to spend with his children, which were so happy. And he details what they did and all that stuff. And he can only cling to those memories. Devastated.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Boone.
I have to admit that I found this case shocking and almost impossible to comprehend. And I'm not sure how I would have dealt with it as an investigating officer. How do you shut out your personal and emotional response and just do your job? I think the final word should go to Keith Hardy, whose team did such a brilliant and sensitive job.
So when you kind of walked away from this inquiry, which is very, very sad, just terribly sad that 3 young children have lost their lives at such an early age, and you know, what thoughts were going through your mind, Keith, at the conclusion of this when Theresa was found guilty of culpable homicide through diminished responsibility?
I suppose taking it back a stage, when we completed the inquiry, my biggest concern was the welfare of my staff. You know, from guys who'd been in and seen the horrific crime scene, guys who had attended the post-mortem and had to watch the post-mortem with 3 children. And, you know, for example, typists. who have to type up these statements or reports, pathology reports. What's the impact on these people? We came in after the event. Me and my team could do nothing to prevent Theresa killing her 3 children. I'm not sure anybody could have, but we certainly couldn't. And that's what I used to say to them at the briefing. Look, we couldn't do it. We're reactive. We're reacting to something that's happened, and our job is to bring the person responsible to justice. And that's what we did.
So where does the Riggi case sit in your career path of being a successful detective?
It was 3 children, 3 young children, and I'll never, ever forget it. I mean, I attended the funeral of the 3 kids in Aberdeen because I just felt, you know, I didn't want to be part of it. I just wanted to show my respect that, you know, we acknowledge what a terrible, terrible tragedy this was. One thing that sticks in my mind quite significantly is one of the very, very experienced detectives who attended the post-mortem. And the post-mortems were run at the same time. 3 post-mortems were going on at once.
What, simultaneously?
Yeah, yeah.
In the same room?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the officers, a very experienced officer, had an 8-year-old son. And he was very, very good and capable of, you know, compartmentalising these type of inquiries. But he got in late that night after being at the post-mortems, and his wife asked him to bath his 8-year-old son. And he says, and when I put him in the bath, he says, that's when I broke down. And I think, you know, people who had kids of the same age and who can relate to things like that, it's almost harder. That's one story that sticks in my mind about that case, what a massive, massive impact it had on everybody that was involved in the inquiry. And I don't think we should ever forget that.
No. My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. The case I'm looking at today is one of the most complex investigations in British crime history. A series of rapes committed in and around London between 1982 and 1986, culminating in the murder of 3 women by John Duffy and David Mulcahy. What's very unusual about the murders and the rapes is that it was committed across different force areas by 2 men working together and egging each other on and instigating their crimes by saying, shall we go out hunting? Hunting for their victims of prey. But 2 of them were both getting satisfaction from raping and violence committed on them. I'm going to speak to Paul Dockley, who's a senior detective in Hertfordshire Police. It's really important to get an idea of the complications and complexities of an investigation such as this.
afternoon.
Good afternoon, Paul Dockley. My name's Jackie Molton, ex-detective from the Met.
Hi, Jackie.
I'd love to come and speak to you, Paul, if I may. One of the cases that I'm looking at in detail is the case of the railway rapists and murders, John Duffy and David Mulcahy. I know that you had a very important role in this investigation, which was very complex, involving 3 police forces. Can I come and see you and have a chat about your involvement, please?
Well, certainly. I'd love to see you.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Nice to talk to you, Jackie. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
This is the case of John Duffy and David Mulcahy, known as the railway rapist, one of the most complex, complicated cases in British crime history. On the 18th of May, 1986, a young, fresh bride, Anne Locke, went missing on her way back from work in central London to her home in Brookman Park. Paul Dockley was the senior investigating officer in Hertfordshire.
I wasn't on duty, actually, on the 18th, but on the 19th I came on duty to be briefed immediately by the night shift inspector, who was still on duty, who said, "We had a strange one last night. There's a lady gone missing. She's recently married. She works for London Weekend Television. She had been called into work unusually on a Sunday. She didn't have a car because our car was being sold. So she borrowed a bike. She lives at an address in Brookman's Park with her husband and her grandmother, and they seem to be a fairly tight unit. She's recently returned from the Seychelles on a honeymoon, been back about 10 days, and she took off to the railway station on the bike. And she bought a ticket, put a bike in the cycle shed, and got the train, which I think was about 3:30 in the afternoon, from memory. And off she went to London Weekend Television. We know she handed out the news items to various drivers to be delivered to producers' houses. But from that point onwards, there have been no sightings of her.
So having caught the underground under Weekend TV is near Waterloo Station,
Absolutely.
So having got the underground to Finsbury Park,
Yeah.
catching the train then to Brookman's Park, you didn't know, did you, at what point from that journey she would have gone missing from?
No. And yes, we surmise that that was her route home and that's the route she would have taken. But we didn't have any substantial intelligence, data, anything to say she actually got on the train to Brookman's Park.
Lots of people go missing in London daily.
Yes.
I mean, actually hundreds.
Yes.
What was it then for you as a detective, having been alerted by the uniformed officer, when you looked at this? What was your feeling that this was something different? It wasn't a normal kind of missing from home?
Person, no.
Yeah.
The fact that her cycle was found actually behind the cycle shed, so it had been secreted, in my view. Immediately I was thinking, she's not going to put a bike behind there. Why would the bike be behind the bike shed?
What did you have? What evidence did you have? Did you have any witnesses?
Well, we had a witness who had actually been there the night previously, the Saturday night, a group of witnesses, in fact, who'd gone down on the platform, and there was a bench. As you walk down onto the platform, somebody had put a bench across the steps, as though as to make an obstacle for something, to make it difficult for somebody to get round the bench. But that was of interest to us, because it almost gave some sort of, well, was there some sort of pre-planning going on here? And then at a time around 10 o'clock-ish, somebody in the vicinity of the ticket office heard a scream. But that's all we had.
Evidence for Anne's whereabouts could have been anywhere along her route home, but Paul decided to start the search at Brookman's Park, Anne's intended destination. And that's where we're going now. When you're faced with a rural environment such as this, and you have to search it, if you just look around here All this grass, nettles, brambles. Where do you start?
Right, well, we have experts. In those days, it was called pulsar searching.
Yeah, pulsar.
And these guys gridded the site and actually went, and, you know, just an area from here down to the gate, okay, it doesn't look too much. But when you have to cut it down, so you're either using scythes or strimmers to cut the grass down, and what you're looking for is any evidence. So it could be a ring, it could be a ticket, it could be an item of clothing, a sock, you know, anything, everything we need to actually gather. That's fingertip searching. Well, this particular summer, it was very warm, humid, and as soon as we cut stuff down, it was growing again. So we had teams of maybe 24 guys working either side of the track.
It was indeed you, Paul, who found a relevant piece of evidence belonging to Anne, wasn't it? Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I was getting frustrated, to be perfectly honest with you. 6 weeks into the investigation, we hadn't found anything of Anne's. The search teams, you know, were out most days. And I decided to leave my office from where I was sort of involved in the investigation work. And I'd done it before, and on my own days off, I'd walk the area. But I actually walked down here. I walked to Hawkshead Lane, where I turned left, went over the bridge, and there's a footpath that comes back towards Brookman's Park. And then there's a brook, and as I'm going along the brook, the guys were searching on the ground. And I was in an elevated position, and I was looking up in the tree, and I saw a book. I just saw the leaves of a book blowing in the wind. And then when we took the book off, it was Anne's address book. And at that point, I knew that Anne was here, or I felt in my heart that she was somewhere around in this vicinity. And then the guys started to search further down along the brookside, and they found her diary.
As Paul Dockley and his team continued their search for missing newlywed Anne Locke, unbeknown to them at the time, 2 murder cases would throw a whole new light on their investigation. Months before Anne had disappeared, the body of 15-year-old Dutch national Marta Tamboza had been found near Horsley Station. The case came under Surrey Police Force, and witnesses said they had seen 2 men accost the teenager. She had been raped and strangled with her own belt. But there was a 3rd case. A few months earlier, another missing person case had become a murder inquiry, this time in the Metropolitan Police area of Hackney Wick.
On the 29th of December 1985, Alison Day left her home in Upminster to go and visit her boyfriend, who was working on a Sunday in Hackney Wick. It was in the afternoon, and she didn't arrive.
In December 1985, an underwater team had uncovered the body of 19-year-old Alison Day in the canal. Her body was found weighted down. She too had been raped and murdered. As a former Met officer, I know this area well, so I'm on my way there now.
Hi, this is a message for Brian Roberts. My name is Jackie Molton, formerly of the Met, and I'm revisiting the case of Alison Day. I believe you were the exhibit officer for that case and know the details of what happened to her at Frog Island. Would you be happy to meet me at the location?
Hi, Jackie. This is Detective Sergeant Brian Roberts. I'm happy to tell you about it. I'll meet you there.
Brian, how close is the railway station where Alison went missing from in relation to where we're standing?
It's probably only about 50 yards up lines from this railway bridge.
They forced her to walk on this parapet, which is on the outside of the bridge, what we're looking at.
Exactly.
Which
yes.
is, how wide is that footing?
Probably about 8 inches, I'd suggest, to maybe a foot wide. But of course, the only grips on there are the actual reinforcement struts that stick out from the bridge itself, making it even narrower.
This is real torture, isn't it?
It is, it is. And of course, it resulted in her falling. She made her way to the bank, and that's where they grabbed her again. They walked her down that embankment, and what we do know for certain is that about 200 yards down this embankment, towards the Eastway, her body was recovered on the 17th of January.
There's evidence when she was recovered that the body had been weighed down by stones.
That's correct. In fact, it was 2 granite sets, which are essentially cobblestones. But unlike sort of the cobblestones you may see that are just sort of a small item, these were maybe 8 inches deep, made of solid granite, so they're quite substantial in weight.
Here we are now, and it's a very busy thoroughfare. Cyclists, pedestrians, lots of activity, London diversity at its best.
Yes.
So in terms of population or frequenting by people in 1985, would it have been kind of bleak, a bit derelict?
This was a bleak, cold, wet place. And it's scary that an individual would drag a girl through this area and then ultimately kill her.
It's just despicable, isn't it?
It is.
After Alison Day's body was recovered, she was taken for a post-mortem, where it was recorded the cause of death was strangulation by use of a tourniquet made from the hem of Alison's own top. There was a large knot tied and placed over her larynx. The pathologist noted this could point to the suspect having an in-depth knowledge of martial arts.
I think when you come here and you're in the atmosphere of this place and you see the bridge, you see the canal, you see the footpath, just really brings it home. These 2 despicable men, what they did to this victim and to other victims is beyond words, to be honest. It's just beyond words.
So now we have 3 different police forces investigating 3 women who had disappeared at railway stations, 2 of which were murder inquiries, but none of them knew about each other. The integrated police system, Holmes, wasn't in operation back then, so the only way of linking up these cases was pure luck. And that is exactly what happened.
I was very lucky in the first few days of the inquiry. I contacted Crime Watch, which was a fairly new program in those days, and I spoke to somebody on the team there and told them that we had this missing person and that she worked for London Weekend Television.
Had Crime Watch ever featured a missing person case before?
No, and I think I'm really lucky to actually get a case onto Crime Watch. Missing persons weren't on their criteria for broadcast. Basically, what happens is that the senior officers responsible for the cases would stand up in front of all the people who were answering the telephones, who again were detectives working from incident rooms, and brief them about their various cases. And it was on this occasion that I sat there and in front of Vince McFadden, who was the Detective Chief Superintendent from Surrey, and Charlie Farquhar, who was the Superintendent from the Met, dealing with Alison Day and Marty Tamboza murders. And I was hit, I think, most certainly by Vince McFadden's account of the abduction and the murder of Marty Tamboza, because he described East Horsley Station, and basically I could see Brookman's Park, in that it was a quiet, rural location, nice houses around the area, a footpath that goes alongside the railway line, which is everything that we had in Brookman's Park. And although I was a young detective and they were senior officers, post actually making these presentations, I approached them and said, you know, they'd heard my presentation about Anne going missing from Brookmans Park railway station, and I said, the circumstances are so aligned to yours, in that both your murders are around railway stations, and I have a missing person around a railway station. And if you look at the geography around London, it's sort of east, west, and northwest. So, you know, I raised the alarm, if you like, but I'm pretty sure that Charles and Vince had already drawn that connection with their two cases.
What was their reaction? Because in murder inquiries, as we both know, we're always told to listen to the minority voice, the detective at the back of the room that goes, excuse me, Governor, and instead of dismissing them, you know, we actually say, what have you got to say?
And they were very receptive. In fact, I was so pleased with their response that I phoned my senior investigating officer and said, you know, I think we should have a meeting with these two investigations to see whether we can learn anything from their investigation that's pertinent to ours.
As the three forces pooled their resources, the investigation took a dramatic turn. 2 months after Anne Locke had gone missing, her body was found by railway workers. She was just 10 yards outside the police search area near Brookmans Park Station. Paul Dockley's missing person case was now also a murder inquiry. We've returned to the scene to find out what happened.
Without going into great detail, because it's distressing, the body 6 weeks laying dead in humid conditions would not have been a very nice sight, would it?
No, it deteriorated a great deal in that period of time.
How was she identified?
She was identified by her teeth, and there was no physical identification because of the deterioration of the body.
After the body of Anne Locke was found, it strengthened the theory that these three murders were committed by the same people. So Surrey, Hertfordshire and the Met continued to work together, but now joined forces with a fourth inquiry that seemed to be linked.
Unbeknown to me, there'd been a series of rapes in London, and this was called the Hart Inquiry, and some really great work had been undertaken by the Met in relation to a series of rapes that occurred in and around railway stations. And they'd really worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these inquiries, but they've been running from 1982, and we were now in 1986.
Was there any indication from any of the victims or witnesses that two men, not one, two men were involved in the rapes?
Yes, there were reports of rape where two men have been involved in assaulting women in and around railway stations. And basically, it's very unusual to have two men working together in concert. So, you know, they're actually one, and that's what these women were saying. It was almost like these guys knew what the next move was from the other person.
I think one victim described them as two bodies, one brain.
Absolutely
because
right.
They were so in sync with each other.
Yes, they were. Most of the victims reported that they came off the train and they were comforted by there was a man behind them and a man in front. So almost, you know, they're thinking, I'm being followed, but there's a man in front of me. And the man in front would turn around and grab them and then throw them over a fence. And as we all know, in the areas around railway stations, there's always some scrubland. And that's where the offences were taking place.
All the rapes and murders were committed by two men near railway stations, and evidence from the Marta Tamboza case suggested a knowledge of martial arts. The police knew that if someone had committed a sexual offence previously, they were likely to do so again. So they turned their attention to a list of known sexual offenders called the Z-Men. With more than 2,000 men on the list, every single one of them had to be found and questioned. One of the names on the list was John Duffy, who had a previous conviction for raping his wife.
Now, I think he was like, say, 1,020 on the list of the Z-Men. And they interviewed him one evening, and the next day they came in and they came into my office and said, "We interviewed a guy last night, we're not happy with him."
Why was that?
Don't know why. They didn't know why. They said, "I just don't like what I feel."
So somebody comes to you and says, well, I'm not really happy with that. What do you do as Detective Inspector with that information?
Well, I obviously question them as to why. And they're saying, well, he's a railway worker. He's separated from his wife. They don't have any children. He lives with his mum and dad. He's just odd. He's into martial arts. He didn't want to answer some of our questions, and there was, something that for us wasn't quite right. He said the fact that he's raped his wife as well, so he's like, he has offended sexually previously, and it was agreed that they would go back to West Hampstead Police Station. In those days, they had a Cardex system, and find out as much as they can about him. And when they went to West Hampstead Police Station, they phoned me and they said, "You won't believe this, but last night he turns up at West Hampstead Police Station."
After he'd been interviewed by the police?
After he'd been interviewed by the police, he'd been slashed across the chest, beaten up, said he lost his memory. They took him home. He didn't remember his home. He didn't remember his mum and dad. He didn't remember the dog they had. Couldn't remember anything. And he's been sectioned, and he's now in Free and Barnet Hospital under a mental health order. So we weren't allowed to interview Duffy for 6 months.
For 6 months?
Yeah.
Why?
Because basically he was under medical care, and they were saying, "No, you can't interview him. This guy's ill, he's lost his memory, he can't help you anyway because he's lost his memory." And so basically, thank you, but no thank you.
When Duffy was released from hospital, the Joint Police Forces had a surveillance team following his every move.
On one evening, he returned to the site of one of the rapes that was being investigated by the Heart Inquiry. And as a result of returning to that scene, although he didn't do anything, he was in that vicinity, he was arrested. And he was detained, and they went to search his parents' home. And would you believe that during the course of the investigation, Marty Temboza had been tied from behind with a string called somyan. And somyan is a greasy type string that in the 60s and 70s, Mum would send away her linen to the laundrette, and it would come back wrapped in brown paper tied with this greasy string. And when we took the string to the producers of the string, which I believe was in Holland, they said, "This is really unusual because the piece of string is from the end of the loom, and we don't normally use the end of the loom. But if you find the ball of string that this has come from, we will be able to do a mechanical fit." And what we discovered was in the outside toilet, in a bucket, in the house where Duffy was staying, was a ball of somyan. And thankfully, it was a mechanical fit.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
This was enough to charge John Duffy with Marta Temboza's murder, and all three forces started interrogating him for their respective killings.
Now, John Duffy was happy to talk to us about martial arts, but he wasn't happy to talk. He was saying, "I don't remember. I lost my memory. I've been in hospital. I can't remember anything."
What about the string?
Whatever you tell me. I don't know. I can't remember what I've done. So that's what we're faced with. We're faced with somebody who is saying, "I have amnesia. I don't know anything." I'll tell you what I like doing. I like doing martial arts.
He didn't lose his memory about that then?
No. And there were other things that he didn't lose his memory about that we know in those 2 weeks that he was out from the hospital, you know, he could still remember his video card, membership number, stuff like that.
Selective.
Very selective.
So he's in custody, he's got memory loss. Police know that when he was younger, he committed some petty offences, let's say, with Mulcahy.
Yeah.
You also know that there may have been 2 men who had committed the rapes.
Yep.
Was Mulcahy arrested at the same time or just after Duffy?
Yeah. Mulcahy was arrested because we knew that he was Duffy's main contact for anything that they've done previously. They went to school together. They worked. They worked in other criminal enterprises together. They would have been good friends. They went running together. Mulcahy was arrested and interviewed. The thing is that we go back to the precursor to DNA. Duffy was a secretor. He was an A secretor. And we knew that that connected him to some of the victims. Also, both were put on identity parades, and Duffy was picked out by a number of witnesses. Okay, so that actually sustained the case. Mulcahy, on the other hand, wasn't. Duffy eventually was charged.
What was he charged with?
He was charged with 3 murders, and I think it was 9 rapes.
Did Duffy face a trial? Did he plead not guilty?
He pleaded not guilty. He was convicted. He went to trial, claiming that he'd lost his memory, couldn't remember anything.
Was he found guilty?
He was found guilty of the Alison Day and the Marty Tamboza murder.
Why was he found not guilty of your murder?
Because the jury were advised by the judge there was insufficient evidence in which to actually tie him to the Anlock murder.
So as an investigator, you have still got an undetected murder in your crime books.
I have.
What did you do with that information, therefore? Did you reinvestigate it? Did you look at other prime suspects?
Well, the difficulty is, at that point in time, we virtually exhausted, as you would imagine. This investigation was sizable in the histories of Hertfordshire, Surrey and the Met.
Cost a lot of money.
A lot of money. And, of course, there comes a point where all the officers are returned to their original duties. Once the case is dealt with, the case is wrapped up, the file's put away, all the evidence is still retained because we've still got an open case.
And so the case of Unlock was kind of closed down. That must have been a real punch in the stomach for you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I felt for the family because there's nothing worse than thinking, I've been through all this and the guy's not convicted, but the police believe it's him. You know, very few people understand the judicial process, and they don't understand how a judge, midway through a trial, can say, members of the jury, I want you to discount what you've heard about the Anlock inquiry, you know, because there isn't sufficient evidence in my view.
In 1988, Duffy was locked up. Mulcahy was a free man. That seemed like the end of the matter. But 10 years later, everything changed. The case was reopened. I'm now going to speak to Andy Murphy. Andy Murphy was the detective in charge of Operation Marford, which reinvestigated, if you like, for the first time in British crime history, the original conviction of John Duffy and the investigation into the rapes and murders. So this was kind of many, many, many years later, fresh eyes looking upon it and the dilemmas and the complexities, problems that he faced. So it's really, really essential to speak to him because it was from this investigation that Mulcahy was convicted.
Good afternoon, Andrew speaking.
Oh, hi, Andy. My name's Jackie Molton, a detective from the Met. Andy, I'd love to come and interview you. The reason being that I'm looking at the convictions of Duffy and Mulcahy, very, very complicated case. You were the detective in charge of Operation Marford. May I come and speak to you and have a chat about your involvement, please?
Yeah, of course. It was a real complex case. As you know, it actually picked up the pieces 10 years after Duffy was arrested and convicted, and Mulcahy was arrested but never convicted. It was a fascinating case.
That summer, there'd been a series of rapes in and around West Hampstead, 6 in total. And it bore all the hallmarks of a previous series that had taken place 10 years ago and that actually resulted in 3 murders. The women were approached from behind. There was no specific profile. The youngest was a schoolgirl, and the oldest was a retired lady. There was increase in confidence in the attacks and an increase in violence. And some of my team at the time had been involved in the original Operation Heart, which had been looking at John Duffy and David Mulcahy. And one of the first things for us was to actually find out whether Duffy had been released. He would have been the prime suspect, but he wasn't. He was still in prison, firmly locked up, not going anywhere. But the intelligence checks showed that a suspect that was originally arrested with Duffy, David Mulcahy, was actually still living in the Hampstead area, in and around where the offences took place. Because of the similarities, made a decision that we would arrest Mulcahy, interview him, and obtain a DNA profile, because we had profiles on the rapes. Mulcahy was arrested, but the profile came back as negative. He wasn't the Loudwater suspect.
Another man was found to be the Loudwater suspect, and he was tried and convicted. Mulcahy walked free yet again.
Midweek, one afternoon, the phone went in the office, and it was the scientist from the Loudwater series, from the FSS. And what she'd managed to do was actually to go back to historic exhibits.
With the new DNA?
With the new DNA profile. And she rang him and said, Andy, just ringing to tell you that we've got Mulcahy's profile on some clothing from one of the victims back in the 80s.
Wow.
It was, gee, you know, Christ, what do we do now?
So you've got this information. So what was your strategy then?
I think when it first comes through, you think, great, you know, we've got a DNA profile. And then when you actually think it through and chatting with Liz about the exhibit that she'd found, the exhibit was a 10-year-old exhibit. Records had shown that the exhibit should have gone on for destruction, but it hadn't been. So really, in terms of a prosecution, it was pretty worthless.
Because the defence would get hold of that and there would be some form of allegations of contamination, lack of continuity. It should have gone off for disposal.
Absolutely.
And so therefore you would have lost it on the first knockings.
Yeah, absolutely. But it also threw up, what do we now do with Mulcahy? For the first time, we had concrete proof that he was at the very least a rapist, possibly a murderer. He was still on the streets of London. What do you do?
Had John Duffy, at this time, had been in prison for obviously 10 years, indicated at any point, A, you know, his guilt, and B, that somebody else was involved with him?
Sure, he had. He'd started to talk about the offendings. He was undergoing psychological counselling by psychologist Jenny Cutter. And during those interviews, Duffy was starting to talk initially about the rapes. He'd named Mulcahy, and over a period of time, he went on to talk about the murders.
When Duffy began to open up about the rapes and murders, he inexplicably began reenacting every minute detail. His accounts were so disturbing that one young officer present at the questioning went on sick leave and eventually left the force.
Why didn't you go and knock on his door?
I think, again, if you look at that confession, if you look at John Duffy, he wasn't your perfect witness. He was probably the worst witness you could get. He was a convicted rapist, a convicted murderer. He was now saying that when I was arrested back in the 80s and claimed that I was beaten up and had amnesia, I lied. when I went to the Old Bailey. I lied. I didn't have amnesia. I just couldn't find a way out of it. But I did develop amnesia because I couldn't deal with what I've done. So I switched everything off, and for a number of years, I denied that I was that rapist and that murderer.
Because he couldn't face it?
Because he couldn't face it. And then through Jenny Cutler, he was gradually piecing things back together. But for us, a convicted rapist, murderer, liar, lied at the Bailey, didn't have amnesia, developed amnesia, now talking to a psychologist, it's not worth the paper it's written on.
So is that a matter of disproving? Are you trying to disprove what Duffy had said or prove what Duffy had said to show that in any interview he was telling the truth?
From day one, it was all about disproving John Duffy. Disproving what he was now saying to his counsellor. Because if any one part of John Duffy's story was proved to be inaccurate, no matter how irrelevant, whether it involved the offence itself or not, if John Duffy was shown to be lying in that series of interviews, then he fell apart as a witness. So we set out to disprove John Duffy.
I've been down to Hackney Wick, in actual fact, to look at the bridge where the murder of Alison Day had occurred at that railway station, and it was indicated that she was forced to walk on the outside of that bridge. And just looking at that bridge, it was horrific just to look at it. And how on earth did this girl do it in the freezing cold? Was this one of the other elements you had to disprove?
Yeah, well that actually came up during the trial. In the middle of the trial, Duffy had given his account, exactly as you say, that Alison had been captured off the train, taken underneath the bridge. Duffy had raped her, Mulcahy hadn't. She was made to dress in the dark. She was then taken back up the railway bank, and Mulcahy made her edge, as you say, along the outside of the bridge. So if you can imagine looking across the railway lines with the canal behind her. There's absolutely no reason for that. That she got 3/4 of the way across, fell into the canal, scrambled up. And the defence said, well, this is physically impossible. You can't do that. So that afternoon, we scooted back down to Hackney Wick, and we got one of the WDCs, the detective constables from the team. She dressed in clothing similar to Alison, and she actually edged away across the railway bridge. And we recorded that, took it back to court to show that it was physically possible. At the time, a train went by. So Alison must have been going through. You just can't imagine. But we were able to show that it was physically possible, despite the thought that this can't happen. It could.
Despite the time constraints and Mulcahy denying everything, Andy managed to build a watertight case. And with Duffy's now believable evidence, Mulcahy and Duffy were both found guilty. They received life sentences for 14 rapes and the murders of all 3 women, Marta Tamboza, Alison Day and Anne Locke. I have never come across 2 men committing such abhorrent and torturous crimes as these, and I can't begin to understand what motivated them. So I'm hoping forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone can shed some light on these evil partners in crime.
In your experience, how frequent is it that 2 men operate together in crimes like that of rape and murder?
It is comparatively rare. It's not rare in various crimes for 2 men to operate together, say, just take an ordinary example, armed robbery, say, or something like that. That's very common. But to work together in this way and have had such an extraordinary bond from the age of 11 years old, which was when I gather they met, and to escalate through relatively petty crimes to a series of rapes and murder is quite uncommon for 2 to be joined at the hip in that way.
What I found fascinating is that it took a number of years before Duffy started to open up and talk about another person and being involved. In your experience dealing with men in prison,
Is that kind of common, not common?
Not common, but what I would say is that it won't just have been the therapy, in my view, that caused him to open up and implicate Mulcahy. It would have been the fact that he knows that he was going to stand a cat-in-hell's chance of ever getting out of prison. He's got to be cooperative. Always be suspicious about motives. When people who do such ghastly things for years and then get banged up and they suddenly realise, well, Mulcahy's out there, he's all right, he thinks he's invincible, and I'm going to be stuck in here forever. So what if I help the authorities? And then, in so doing, perhaps they'll give me an earlier release.
This case was huge in scope and incredibly complicated. But all the detectives and officers involved never forgot the human side. 14 women's lives were changed forever, and 3 were tortured and brutally killed. I know from personal experience that some cases get under your skin, and leaving them behind can be really tough. So I think the final word should go to Paul Dockley, who investigated the murder of Anne Locke, a case I know affected him deeply.
I've never forgotten this day in 33 years. And in that 6-week period till I found her book, and 8-week period till we found her body, she was part of my life. Absolutely part of my life. I knew her husband, Lawrence. I knew her grandmother. I knew Lawrence's mum, dad. I knew all her friends. She's almost like written into your history. You have to try and compartmentalise everything. It's not easy. You know, I was mortified. I probably knew that that was going to be the outcome after 8 weeks of no contact. And she wasn't a lady that would disappear like that. So it was inevitable in many respects, but she was part of my life and still is.
My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect.
In my experience, any murder is shocking, but the case I'm looking at this time is almost impossible to understand. The killing of a mother, Rachel Entwistle, and her baby daughter Lillian by her own husband in January 2006. This was no crime of passion. British-born Neil Entwistle killed his wife in cold blood, then fled their home in the US to return to the UK. There seemed no apparent motive for the murder, leaving the family of the victims utterly bewildered and devastated by what he did. I've flown to Boston, the location of this case, to find out how investigators on the ground pieced together what happened. and what lay at the root of this incomprehensible of crimes.
The Neil Entwistle case is really tragic. Here was a family living the American dream in a suburb of Boston called Hopkinton. Beautiful house. To all intents and purposes, happily married couple with a 9-month-old baby. It's tragic because the bodies of Rachel and Lillian were found dead in bed. Entwistle had driven to Logan Airport in Boston, caught a one-way ticket back to the UK, left his hired car at Boston Airport, and never returned for the family's funeral. This is a case that was kind of fairly new to me. I heard a little bit about it in the press. So I'm really fascinated to find out why a man like Entwistle would murder his wife and his own 9-month-old baby. So I've got a lot of people to interview, the forensic scientists, the detectives from Hopkinton, the district attorney. So I'm hoping that they're going to unravel for me the story of Entwistle and why he did what he did.
On January the 20th, 2006, Priscilla Matarazzo called police in Hopkinton, an affluent suburb of Boston. She was concerned that her daughter Rachel had not been in touch for several days. All attempts to locate her had failed.
Hi, this is Priscilla Matarazzo. I'm calling because my daughter moved to Hopkinton about a week ago.
Yes.
I haven't heard from her in 2 days, and I was up there today. She was expecting me. There was nobody there, and I just heard from her girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
She was expecting for supper tonight, and there's no one there. We can't reach her by cell phone, and it's really unusual for her to do this.
The last time you spoke with her, everything seemed all right. She didn't tell you that she was going away unexpectedly or anything like that? No? Okay.
She's the type of girl that calls me whenever she does anything.
Sure. Okay. Well, yep. Okay. We'll send somebody up. We'll check it, and then I'll give you a call back and let you know how we make out.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. You're entirely welcome. Bye.
Local officers went to the Entwistles' home to carry out a well-being check to see if there were any problems. They entered the house, but this cursory check only revealed that the family were not there. In a respectable neighbourhood like this, there was no reason to suspect anything bad had happened. To find out more about what happened next, I want to meet Detective Sergeant Scott Van Relton from the Hopkinton Police.
Hello, Scott. This is Jackie Molton, formerly of the Metropolitan Police in London. I'm in Boston re-examining the case of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle. Would you have time to talk to me about the case, please?
Hi, Jackie. Yes, I'd like to speak to you in regards to the Entwistle case. Look forward to speaking with you. Thank you.
Scott, on the 22nd of January 2006, you were a detective at Hopkinton Police and reported for duty that day. Can you tell me what happened? It was a Sunday, I understand.
It was Sunday evening. I reviewed the logs from the daily logs from my days off, and had seen that there was a missing persons case on Saturday, the day prior. I spoke with the officers involved, asking about any follow-up that we should be doing, and it was determined that it was pretty suspicious that a whole family was missing. I had made a decision that we would go back to the neighborhood, re-enter the house, and spend a little bit more time looking for anything that was out of place or indications of where they may have gone.
So I understand, Scott, that when the mother reported the daughter no reply, that the police had done a cursory search of the house, a well-being check the day before, and not noticed anything.
That's correct. So the officers on Saturday evening had entered the house and done a search, and it's a real quick search. Basically poking your head in every room, making sure that there isn't somebody laying on the ground in need of medical assistance. So knowing that they'd already done that and they had found nothing, myself and the sergeant entered the house while the other officers were talking to the neighbors, and we entered the master bedroom and everything looked normal. We both had noticed that when we were coming up the staircase to the second floor that there was a strange odor. That odor wasn't there the night prior. We thought it was like dirty diapers. We pulled the covers back. We saw Rachel Entwistle laying on her back, and the baby Lillian laying on the left side of her chest with a bunch of pillows around them. It was obvious to us that there was signs of death, that there was nothing that we could do medically for them at this time, and at this time we treated it as a crime scene.
Could you tell at that point that they, or how they had been killed?
I could not. At that time, we had believed, because of the amount of pillows that were around them, that maybe they had been suffocated or a pillow had been put over their face, but we didn't see anything else. There was no excessive blood. There was no round casings from the firearm on the ground anywhere. So we were really unsure of how they had died. We covered them back up, and we searched the rest of the house to include the attic, basement, everything outside, looking for Neil Entwistle to see if he had been a victim also. When we determined that the entire house was clear, that's when I had made notification to my chief of police. I called in the state police, and I also contacted the medical examiner.
The findings of the police team so far had been incredibly shocking, and the horrifying details of the crime they uncovered was totally at odds with the quiet, affluent suburb of Hopkinton. To get a feel for the crime scene myself, Scott Van Relton has agreed to meet me there.
This beautiful area that we're in now, this cul-de-sac, these beautiful houses, it is, to all intents and purposes, the American dream for a young couple and a new baby. In you and I experience of murder, this would be the last place that one would expect a murder scene to be.
Absolutely. This is very typical of our town. Comfortable homes with property, quiet neighborhood. You'd expect to see kids playing in the streets. Very low traffic and low crime in this area, and it is not something that we're accustomed to.
So presumably they'd only been here 10 days, and we know that lots of boxes hadn't been unpacked. So I doubt if anybody knew who they were here.
The neighbors knew the owners of the house had moved out and the house was up for rent, but they hadn't had a chance to actually meet with the Entwistles and really get to know them. So when we were canvassing the neighborhood, while we believed that they were missing, there was very little information to go on.
When you speak to the officers in the case at length about Neil Entwistle, you know, you can't get a better American dream than this. And for whatever reason it was that he decided that day, within 10 days of this young family moving into this beautiful house, that he should end his wife's life and that of the baby.
What had started out as a mother's concern for the whereabouts of her daughter and grandchild had developed into a full-blown murder investigation. I'm hoping that Detective Captain Mary Riggi, one of the forensic analysts who attended the scene, can shed more light on the case.
I'm going to visit Mary, the forensic scientist, and talk to her about all of the evidence that they found.
In 2006, Mary Riggi was a crime scene responder for Massachusetts State Police and a core member of the forensics team called to the murder scene at the Entwistles' home.
Mary Riggi, we know that Rachel Entwistle and her daughter Lillian were murdered. Can you paint a picture of the crime scene as you saw it in relation to their deaths?
We knew that the victims were already located on the second floor in the master bedroom, and that's the area we wanted to focus on first.
And how was Rachel situated within that bed and her daughter?
Rachel, the mom, was positioned on her left side, and her right arm was across Lillian's chest. Lillian was face up, the infant victim.
And what were the injuries that you saw on both Rachel and Lillian?
When we removed all of those layers, the infant victim was face up, and there was discoloration on her face, some fluid kind of coming from there. It looked like bruising, probably the start of decomposition. And when the mom's arm was moved from the baby's chest, that's when we saw a puncture to the left chest of the infant. Then we realized it was a puncture that appeared to be a gunshot wound.
And there was some allegations by Entwistle's defence team that it was indeed Rachel that had killed Lillian and then turned the gun on herself. But from the position of the bodies that you saw in situ, do you think as a expert crime scene responder that could have been possible?
I don't think so. No. The wound to the mum's head, it was high up, really wasn't until X-ray that we even knew what that was. And she had a puncture to her chest, but it was more of a grazing type puncture. And the clothing had a puncture in it, but I don't know how you would end up in that position after doing that. No, I don't believe that.
Yeah, and you kind of did describe that Rachel's arm was across the kind of body of a child as if she was protecting her.
Yes.
You've been to many crime scenes within your career. Do you ever get triggered by them?
I know they all go up here. They're in here. Some stay with you in a different fashion, though. This was a difficult scene for me. This was difficult. Just the position of the victims and an infant victim, and decomposition had started to set in. There was an odor. Occasionally to this day, you know, and walking by my kids' bedrooms, or, you know, if their comforter's a little puffed up, I have to kind of just give it a little pat down.
And is that a result of that case?
Yes, yes.
Analysis of the crime scene had revealed that both Rachel and her daughter Lillian had been shot at point-blank range. Baby Lillian had been shot in the chest, and Rachel had a single shot wound to the head. What still remained a mystery was the whereabouts of the husband and father of the two victims, Neil Entwistle.
I'm going to phone Bob Manning. He was a detective involved in the investigation of the murder of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle. They were both found dead in their bed, Rachel, the wife of Neil Entwistle, and their 9-month-old baby, Lillian.
In order to trace Neil Entwistle's steps after the murder had taken place, I want to speak to Bob Manning, the Massachusetts State Trooper, who was part of the team tasked with tracking him down.
Hello?
Is that you, Bob?
Yep.
Hi to you, Bob. My name's Jackie Molton, ex-detective from Scotland Yard. I'm here in Boston, and we need to look at the case of Neil Entwistle. I understand you were the detective in charge of that case. On the 22nd of January 2006, you got a call to go to a house in Hopkinton where the body of Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old baby, Lillian, were found dead. Were you aware of the details of the husband of Rachel and where his location was?
Well, not at first. A thorough search was done of the home, and the body, you know, no body, no sign of the husband, Neil Entwistle. And then shortly into the investigation, we received confirmation that the Entwistle car was in the central parking garage at Logan Airport. And as a follow-up to that, we received information that Neil Entwistle had boarded a flight with a one-way ticket and no luggage to London. And so during that time, we were conducting interviews back here of Rachel's mom and stepfather, Joe and Priscilla Matarazzo.
And what did they have to say, the in-laws have to say about their son-in-law, Neil Entwistle?
There was a young couple that were in love that had met over in England and had come over here to live. And we had information that Neil had good employment, and they were trying to establish themselves as a loving husband and wife with a new baby.
So when you, as an investigator, found that Entwistle had gone to London and ended up at his parents' house in Worksop in Nottingham, I understand you made the call to that house to speak to him, to inform him of what had happened.
Yes. Once we confirmed that he was home, it was just natural for us to at least place a phone call. And really the premise of the call was we just had no idea what Neil knew. Is he in trouble? Is he in danger? Is he involved? All those things were wide open.
What did he say?
At the beginning of that conversation, I informed him that we had a serious situation and a death of his daughter and his wife. He confirmed that he knew about the deaths before he left.
What did he tell you had happened prior to that in the morning?
Well, he said he went out and did some errands. So he gave us a couple of stores that he had supposedly went to after having fed Lillian in the morning and then placing Lillian back in bed with Rachel. And then he said he came back a couple of hours later. And when he came back, there was nobody downstairs, which he kind of told us was a little bit odd. And that when he went upstairs, when he first saw them, saw Rachel still in bed.
Well, what did he sound like, you know, having informed him that his wife and child were dead, and he said, I already know that. What was his demeanor on the phone?
He was pretty matter-of-fact for the answers. And he told me, I know, he was pretty just straightforward with some of the answers and the information that he provided.
But his version of events conflicted with the true scenario.
When I walked in, I couldn't see Lily. I could only see Rachel, and she just looked asleep. The first thing I noticed was just her colour. She was pale, and then as I got closer, I could see the blood, and that's when I saw Lily's the top half of the face was out, and I pulled the covers back, and I mean, it's obvious that they were. It was obvious that they weren't alive anymore. Okay.
One of the things he said right from the beginning was that after discovering the bodies, he went to the kitchen and he took out, it's not a quote, but something about taking out a knife, and he was going to hurt himself, but he couldn't.
I went downstairs and I took one of the knives out of the block of knives I had in the kitchen. Maybe I could, but I just didn't have the courage to do it. I think I pondered on that for a minute. I then got in the car.
Did Entwistle give any explanation as to how he had ended up at Logan Airport with no luggage, but coincidentally had his passport in his pocket?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly didn't give any valid or plausible explanation for it, but he did provide information that he felt alone, in need of having to get back home to his family. It was a strange explanation as to this is how you find your wife and infant, and you don't call for help. You don't have any interaction with your in-laws here. You hop on a plane with just enough to get you home. And he provided no information throughout that conversation that there was any reason for any of this to have occurred. But the ironic part of that conversation was that he really gave us a good base to work off of, which was great from an investigative standpoint, because we took what he said and then we worked off it. It wasn't until we got more involved in interviews and forensics examinations that we really started to uncover a lot of deceptive behavior that was going on by this person in his life and in this family.
The deaths of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle had turned into a murder inquiry. The prime suspect was Neil Entwistle, who had many questions to answer. I'm on my way to meet Jerry Leone, the district attorney at that time who oversaw the investigation.
Hi, Jerry. My name is Jackie Molton. I'm a former detective with the Metropolitan Police in London. And I'm over in the United States revisiting the case of Neil Entwistle. Could you spare me some time to talk about the case?
Hi, this is Jerry Leone calling for Jackie Molton. Hello, Jackie. Yes, that's no problem at all. I got your message. I'd be delighted to meet with you.
Jerry, on the 20th of January 2006, it was alleged that Neil Entwistle murdered his wife Rachel and their 9-month-old daughter Lillian in their house in Hopkinton. And you, at that time, were the district attorney. How did you end up with this particular case to prosecute?
As the elected district attorney, at that time, I was responsible for all cases in the office. I would usually go to every single scene. In this case, particularly, I remember it was the day after my son's birthday, and I live in Hopkinton. So I was paged to the scene of the town I lived in to just see a crime scene, which was just an unspeakable crime.
So when you first saw the scene, what were your thoughts as to what had happened?
So I wasn't called to the scene until later, when the first cursory search and then the second search had been done. You go through the crime scene with the detectives, and you make whatever observations you can there, but you're also forming in your mind what your opening and closing is going to be from the first day you get on that crime scene.
Without any prime suspects at that point?
Right. You start to, you see the scene as it was as soon as anybody could, and you make mental observations and you take notes, and some of those things come back to be part of your presentation before a jury.
When did Neil Entwistle become a prime suspect?
A prime suspect is when the evidence started to mount around who had been in the home, who had had access to Rachel and Lillian, and his whereabouts, because it became very curious very quickly that his whereabouts and his attempts to flee and his attempts to leave the country happened in such short order from the time that Lillian and Rachel had been killed.
And then he happens to have his passport in his pocket and finds himself at Logan International Airport to fly home by a one-way ticket to the UK. That is quite a phenomenal kind of defense, isn't it?
None of what Neil Entwistle provided by way of an explanation really made any sense whatsoever. Where the case took an even more awful turn, though, was when he decided to infer or to point the finger at his wife having killed herself and their baby. That was where this case just took an unspeakable turn.
And when he fled to England, he didn't want to be extradited back to the USA. So for all his defense of murder-suicide by his wife, he doesn't want to come back, he doesn't want to be extradited, and he's trying to escape from London still. That's not kind of, the behaviour, is it, of a man who says, well, it was nothing to do with me, it was down to my wife, and how that would leave an impact on Rachel's own family for them to kind of think for a second that their own daughter had killed herself and her child. It's just...
His actions after the fact went beyond consciousness of guilt. In fact, it's cemented and solidified in people's minds that he, in fact, did do this unspeakable act.
Sure, because he fled to England, he fled back to his parents, having bought a one-way ticket. He had previously rented a kind of 4x4 BMW, left that in the airport with the keys tucked under the seat. He had no intention of coming back, did he?
It certainly seems like not only was it calculated, was it intentional, but once he left and was free of the United States, he wasn't coming back.
With the evidence mounting against him, Neil Entwistle became a wanted man, and the US authorities were desperate to find and question him. Police efforts were soon focused on extraditing him from the UK. To find out how events unfolded next, I want to speak to retired Lieutenant James Connolly, who came on board with the case.
Hi, James. This is Jackie Molton. I understand you had the task of locating Entwistle, but your investigations uncovered a lot about his life. I'd be really interested to hear more.
Hi, Jackie. This is Jim Conley. Yes, we're very interested in speaking to Entwistle, as our investigation revealed that he was not who he appeared to be. If you like, we could meet to discuss this case.
When you made some inquiries about Neil Entwistle living in your country, what did you establish in relation to his work, his financial situation, and personal aspects of him?
Through computer searches, forensic searches of the computer, we really determined that the Entwistles were deeply in debt, well over $30,000. Neil was not working and didn't have any prospects, so financially they were in a tough shape.
So we've got a picture of a man heavily in debt, done some searches on the internet, and I think for extramarital affairs, would that be right?
Correct.
So as far as the evidence is concerned against Neil Entwistle, you have got the bodies. I understand that you also had DNA evidence and that there was some evidence in relation to the gun that was used.
Correct.
Did he call for help 911 at all?
No.
Did he call Rachel's parents to say what had happened?
He called the next night. First, his dad called Joe Matarazzo. He spoke to Mr. Matarazzo, and then Neil called a little bit later.
And the gun that was used, Entwistle returned, I understand, to the family home of Rachel's parents.
Yes, this is the gun that Joe Matarazzo told him, showed him how to shoot the weapon in the fall. He took him to a range a couple times, took Neil shooting, showed him how to use it. On the weapon, on the grip, there was handler DNA, what we call handler DNA. There was DNA from Neil Entwistle.
And was there any explanation given by Entwistle to his father-in-law?
Other than that he came and found the bodies that way and just didn't know what to do and panicked and left.
What did the prosecutor advise you to do?
I was directed to go to London. At that time, I didn't realize that we could not just show up and interview a British national without going through the Department of Justice. So I went to London with Trooper Robert Manning, Detective Scott Van Ralton, and Detective Jay Porter from the Hopkinton PD. So we all flew to the UK to get permission to talk to him.
Did you turn up at Scotland Yard?
I did, yes. Yeah.
What did Scotland Yard detectives say to you?
Somehow we got hooked up with an officer from the extradition unit. And I had spoke to them before I came, and they told me not to come because I couldn't talk to them. But I said I was ordered by my boss to come, so when I showed up, they were like, "We told you not to come, what are you doing here?" And we said, "Look, it's a murder of a mother and a child. We're going to talk to them."
In my experience, investigations that cross international borders can be delicate affairs where procedures need to be followed. Before I left the UK, I went to visit retired Detective Sergeant Gary Flood to get an insight into the British perspective on the situation.
Hi, Gary. This is Jackie Molton, formerly of the Met. I know you were with Scotland Yard's Specialist Extradition Unit at the time of the Neil Entwistle case, so I'd really like to find out more about your role, if that was possible.
Hi, Jackie. Gary Flood returning your call. Yes, I dealt with the arrest and extradition of Neil Entwistle. It was a very high-profile and tragic case. I'm happy to meet up and discuss.
Gary, what does the name Neil Entwistle mean to you?
Neil Entwistle was one of the most high-profile, media, intense requests we have on the extradition unit in 2006. I was a supervisor on the Scotland Yard extradition unit, where we had a national responsibility to seek out fugitives that are wanted in countries we had extradition arrangements with. I read and listened to reports of a murder in Boston over the weekend, where a body had been found, and that it wasn't a suspect at the time, person of interest, the husband of the murder victim and child, had fled Boston and was back in the UK. So suspecting this will probably come our way if he turned into a suspect. I then made inquiries with British Airways. We confirmed that he arrived in the UK on the flight from Boston on a Saturday evening and managed to make contact with the investigators in Boston. So we just wanted to be ahead of the game and certainly let the Americans know what can and what can't be done, because it is a complex matter. And the US guys were there's nothing they could do, and they just went home.
And at what point did he become a prime suspect? Was that to do with forensic evidence?
It was, yeah. What happened is that we got indication that there had further evidence had been obtained by the Americans in the form, I understand, of DNA on the gun that was used to murder Rachel and Lillian, and that changed the situation in America. It was her DNA was found on the muzzle, his on the, I understand, on the trigger, and that set them over the line to be able to go to a judge in Boston and obtained a warrant for his arrest for the murder.
When forensic evidence finally revealed that the gun Entwistle had returned to his in-laws was the murder weapon, Gary Flood and his team were able to act. By now, Entwistle had left his parents' home in Nottingham and travelled to London. What followed was a cat-and-mouse chase in London's underground.
How did you arrest him, and where was he when he was arrested?
I made a phone call, made a decision to phone his father. He explained that he was with his friend Dash in London, located Dash Mundin's address in Notting Hill. We then rushed from Scotland Yard to that address. He wasn't at home, so I then phoned Dash Mundin to say, "Where is Neil?" And he then said, "I've just dropped him off at Ladbroke Grove Underground Station. He's just gone on the platform now." So we then rushed and met Dash Mundin, who was at the bottom of the stairs entrance to the Underground Station. So we just missed him. We were aware that 3 stops was Paddington, the main hub. So we got to Paddington, the chance of us locating him there would have been quite hard. Fortunately, there was a underground control room at Ladbroke Grove, and one of my officers, DC Martin Lewis, done some great work, spoke to the control room, who arranged for the train to be stopped at the next available station, which was Royal Oak, 2 stops, 1 stop before Paddington. So we then rushed to Royal Oak, and when we got there, the train was stuck at the platform with all the doors shut. And towards the end of the train, I noticed that Neil Entwistle was sitting down with his back to us.
How did you see? How could you recognise him?
Well, we knew for the media, he'd been all over the media. We knew, we had photographs of him, we knew what he looked like. So we just put our thumbs up to the driver who opened the doors, and then we went in and took him off the train onto the platform and arrested him.
What did he say?
Very quiet, very compliant, almost resigned to it happening. Might have had some understanding of the game was up, so to speak. We arrested, handcuffed him, took him to Charing Cross Police Station. On the journey, I rang Jim to give him the news that we'd found him on a tube train and he's been arrested. He was delighted and relieved, to say the least.
Did you get any kind of indication what kind of guy he was?
He was a bit odd, without a doubt, and he was very, as though he may have had Asperger's or something similar, because he didn't seem to comprehend him being a suspect for the murder in Boston. The unusual thing about him is that when we searched his bag, he had a little blue plastic bag, and inside that he had torn out from the Daily Star sexual adverts. There was also a note to editors of newspapers seeking the highest bidder for his story. The following day he consented to his extradition, which meant once that consent was given, we could make arrangements to get him extradited over to America.
So where in your career, Gary, does Neil Entwistle sit?
It's high up there because of the nature of the horrific murder of a young baby in a mother's arms for what appears to be little reason. We will probably never know why he's done it.
Neil Entwistle is one of the hardest personally for me to comprehend, because I just can't get my head around why a man would kill his own 9-month-old baby and his wife.
Yeah, and it's still, well, what we're now 13 years later, he's still in the media, he's still denying it. And his parents are still convinced that he hasn't done it.
It must be very difficult, mustn't it, for the parents to look at their son through a different lens?
Yes, but I don't think they've looked through that lens yet.
We are left with only Neil Entwistle knowing what happened on that fateful day in Hopkinton.
Indeed.
Neil Entwistle found himself back on US soil. I'm returning to see James Connolly about how events unfolded.
When he eventually came back to the United States, I understand that he freely came back.
He did not fight extradition, that's correct. He came back voluntarily, but he was under arrest.
Of course, he was under arrest.
The U.S. Marshals had a plane, they had a private plane, and they went and got Entwistle and they brought him back.
Were you allowed to interview him as to what happened on that fateful day?
I went on the plane and I advised Entwistle of his rights and asked him if he wanted to speak to us, and he did not want to speak to us. He wanted to talk to a lawyer.
What happens then, from police point of view?
Once he invokes his right to an attorney, we can't say a word to him. If he wants to make a statement or say something, he's welcome to say it. But we can't pursue the questions, and it's, you know, we really can't ask any questions. It's a fine line in the United States. Once they invoke, we're done talking to him. We'll have to wait till he speaks to an attorney.
Was there any point that you observed that Entwistle showed any form of remorse?
I never saw it, but, you know, I do know that he didn't come back for the wake or the funerals of his wife and child.
Neil Entwistle appears to have been living a double life, but this crime is so abhorrent, it leaves many questions. The biggest is, how could a man turn on his own wife and baby in such a cold-blooded way? Someone who may have some answers is forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone.
Julian, out of all of the cases that I've looked at on the real prime suspects, the case of Neil Entwistle I have found truly distressing. Is this a family annihilator?
In his case, he was entirely psychopathic and was living the American dream on the basis of all surface and no substance.
Is that psychopathic?
Yes, very much. And recklessly spending. Now, we know that he had multiple credit cards, all but one of which was entirely maxed out. He had literally reached the end of his rope in terms of finances and in terms of credibility. Another trait of the psychopath is that they are prolific liars and completely conscience-free about doing it. We're talking about manipulative lies and self-serving lies. You have there a psychopath and a narcissist. And if you see parents who are that doting on him, you can see where both those traits came from. Narcissism will be apparent because you're constantly told you're wonderful, you're the best thing since sliced bread. When you get out into the wider world, you can suddenly have an abrupt shock to the psychological system when nobody else thinks you're that wonderful. And so therefore you have to act. And it was all a total facade, a facade that he couldn't keep up indefinitely because he hadn't got the money to do it.
Even if Entwistle's account of the death of his wife and child was true, then to my mind, his behaviour was nothing short of callous and cruel. He seemed totally emotionally disengaged from what had happened. I'm still keen to find out if the final act of these tragic events, Entwistle's trial, reveals any insight into what motivated him to commit these atrocious crimes. I'm going to pay Jerry Leone one last visit. As the district attorney and one of the leading prosecutors in the country, he has dealt with hundreds of cases. He's in prime position to assess Entwistle's character.
Jerry, when Entwistle was listening to the evidence that was being presented, what was his demeanour?
It was largely unaffected. You know, I think that's the best way to put it. He could have been watching a ball game. He could have been, you know, watching TV. He could have been sitting on the back porch looking out over the yard. It was just very unaffected.
When you're prosecuting, you know, you've spoken of this case. It is absolutely so appalling that a man can kill his child. Is there a drive within you to kind of fight for justice as a prosecutor?
I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a father of 2 children. And I've prosecuted baby murders. I've prosecuted murders of spouses. It's difficult to try and fathom how somebody would do something like that. But it's as if when you come across evidence at a scene and you have a dead body, it's really at that point your experience tells you it's evidence. As a prosecutor, you really have to, on some level, be dispassionate about what it is you're trying to get accomplished, because otherwise that can get in the way of what you're trying to accomplish, which is justice in a conviction.
Do you recall how long the jury were out discussing the case?
You know, I don't recall exactly how long the deliberations were. My senses and my memory was, for the amount of time one would have thought for them to have gone through the evidence, that the verdict came back shortly thereafter, so it wasn't an unreasonable amount of time.
And what was the actual verdict that they came back with?
Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty of murder in the first degree of Rachel Entwistle. Guilty of murder in the first degree of Lillian Entwistle.
So 2 verdicts of murder in the first degree, 1 for killing Rachel and 1 for killing Lillian. And he received 2 life sentences, consecutive life sentences, which is under Massachusetts law mandatory. And having said that, you know, my years of experience have taught me that, you know, there's no justice. You're never going to bring back a homicide victim. And although there might be that momentary sense of justice for having seen the person who killed your loved one convicted, it doesn't bring them back. And it certainly doesn't allow you to recover from what is going to be a lifelong heartache.
When the verdict was read, Rachel's parents and the grandparents of Lillian, who had attended every day of the court case, got the opportunity to speak about the pain they had endured.
Neil, you have been judged today by a jury of your peers on earth. But one day you will face the ultimate judgment of your horrific deeds and betrayals.
Suffering does not begin to describe what we have been enduring without our beloved Rachel and Lillian, who gave our lives such purpose and meaning. I have lost 2 generations of my family.
And even Jerry Leone made no secret of his disgust and horror at the actions of Neil Entwistle as the verdict was reached.
I condemn Neil Entwistle for compounding the unspeakable nature of what he has done by disparaging the memory of his wife and vilifying the entire Matarazzo family by his decisions during the course of this trial.
And I think, again, until, as we speak now, that Neil Entwistle is in jail in the United States and still, as I understand it, protesting his innocence. The evidence is overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming.
You'd like to think it was unbelievable, because unbelievable would mean it wouldn't happen. And unfortunately, it did. Part of the problem is we try to rationalize it, right? We try to look at this as rational human beings and say, there's got to be some reason. And it makes us feel better if there's some reason. It's almost more difficult that we can't come to some rational reason in a human being's mind about why he would have done this. And there isn't in a crime like this. There just isn't. It's an incredible cowardice and extreme selfishness.